She stood before 1,000 wolves who once bowed to her bloodline, and they laughed. Not because she was weak, but because she had no wolf at all. The Alpha Bride, rejected at the altar by the most brutal king in the Obsidian Empire, stripped of her crown before it ever touched her head. This is the story of what happens when you discard something you never understood. Stay until the end, hit that like, and drop your city in the comments. Let me know where my pack is watching from, because this tale of survival and vengeance is just beginning. The throne room stank of old blood and newer lies. Leorine Varel stood in the center of it all, her spine straight as a blade even as the world collapsed around her. The marble beneath her feet had been polished to a mirror shine, black as the heart of the empire itself, and she could see her own reflection distorted in its surface. A girl in white silk, a bride who would never be a queen. King Vale Drukkar circled her like a predator, assessing wounded prey. He was everything the legends promised. 7 feet of muscle and menace, his skin marked with the ancestral scars of every king who came before him, his eyes burning with that particular gold that marked the purest bloodlines. The crowd of nobles pressed against the pillars, their whispers rising like static, their wolves stirring beneath their skin with anticipation. This was supposed to be a coronation. It became an execution instead. Vale stopped in front of her, his voice cut through the hall, low and final. "Show them." Leorine's hands trembled, not from fear. She had burned through fear 3 hours ago when the first test failed. This was something else. Rage, maybe, or the beginning of understanding that everything she'd been taught was a carefully constructed lie. "I can't," she said. "Can't?" Vale's laugh was sharp enough to draw blood. "Or won't. There's nothing to show." The hall erupted. Nobles shouted over each other, their voices blending into a single roar of disbelief and mockery. Someone threw something, a piece of fruit, rotten, and it splattered against the hem of her dress. The guards didn't move to stop it. Why would they? She was already dead in every way that mattered here. Vale raised one hand and silence fell like a guillotine. "The Varel bloodline," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the massive hall, "has provided queens to this empire for 6 generations. Every woman who stood where you stand now could shift before her first breath. Your grandmother tore through enemy lines at 14. Your mother commanded a pack of 200 by 16. He leaned close enough that she could smell the wild on him, that scent of fur and fury that marked the truly powerful. "And you," he whispered, "have nothing." Leorine met his eyes. They were beautiful and terrible and completely empty of anything resembling mercy. "I have a pulse," she said quietly. "That's more than you'll have if you keep underestimating what you don't understand." The slap came so fast she didn't see it. One moment she was standing, the next she was on the ground, her cheek burning, blood in her mouth. The marble was cold against her palms. She could hear her heartbeat in her ears, a war drum that refused to quit. Vale crouched beside her, his voice almost gentle now, the kind of gentle that comes before the kill. "I don't underestimate you, Leorine. I see you perfectly, a defect in a perfect line. A mutation that needs to be cut out before it spreads." She spit blood onto his polished floor. Then cut. "Oh, I will, but not with mercy. Wolves do not kill their own. We exile them. Let the wastelands have her. Let her survive if she can, without a pack, without a wolf, without anything but the weakness she was born with." The vote was unanimous. Of course it was. Leorine had grown up in this court, had played with half these nobles' children, had sat through dinners and ceremonies, and the endless dance of power that ruled the empire, and not one of them spoke for her. Not one of them questioned the king's judgment, because in a world where strength was the only currency that mattered, she had just been declared bankrupt. They stripped her of everything before dawn. The silk dress went first, replaced with rough cotton that smelled of the servants' quarters. Her jewelry, generations of Virel heirlooms, was removed piece by piece and locked away. The guards were efficient and cold, their hands impersonal as they transformed her from bride to exile in less than an hour. Her mother didn't come. That hurt worse than the slap, worse than the mockery, worse than any of it. Elara Varel had built her entire existence on the promise of her daughter's ascension. Every lesson, every brutal training session, every whispered reminder that Varels did not fail. All of it had been preparation for a throne that would never be sat upon. The silence from her family's wing of the palace was answer enough. They had already disowned her. The guards led her through corridors she'd walked 1,000 times. But everything looked different now. The tapestries depicting centuries of empire victories seemed to mock her. The portraits of past queens stared down with contempt. Even the servants averted their eyes as she passed, as if weakness were contagious. At the eastern gate, the one that opened onto the wastelands, they stopped. Captain Rion had trained her once, back when everyone still believed she would shift any day now. He'd been patient then, almost kind. Now his face was carved from stone. "You have until the sun clears the wall," he said. "After that, if you're still in sight of the Empire, the archers have orders to fire." Liarine looked at the wasteland stretching before her. Endless gray sand and twisted rock formations, the kind of landscape that ate travelers whole and left nothing but bones. No one survived out there without a wolf. The shift was what allowed you to hunt, to fight, to endure the temperature swings and the predators that roamed the deep desert. Without it, she was just meat waiting to spoil. "Any last words?" Rion asked. There was something in his voice. Not quite sympathy, maybe just the memory of who she used to be. "Yeah," Liarine said. She turned to face the palace, the great black fortress that had been her home for 22 years. "Tell them I'll be back." Rion almost smiled. "No, you won't." "Maybe not, but if I do..." She met his eyes. "They won't laugh then." She walked through the gate before he could respond. The desert hit her like a physical force, heat that made her skin prickle, wind that tasted of salt and ash, and beneath it all a silence so profound it felt like drowning. Behind her, she heard the gate slam shut with a finality that made her bones ache. She didn't look back. Looking back was for people who had something to return to. The first day nearly killed her. Liarine had studied in the wastelands in theory. Every noble child did, learning about the Empire's borders and the dangers beyond. But theory was useless when your tongue was swollen from thirst and your feet were bleeding through stolen shoes that didn't fit. She rationed the single water skin they'd given her, taking sips so small they barely wet her mouth. By midday, it was empty. By afternoon, she was hallucinating. Her father appeared first, walking beside her through the sand. He'd died when she was 7, torn apart in a territorial dispute with a rival pack. She remembered him as laughter and rough hands lifting her onto his shoulders, but the ghost that walked with her now was silent and disappointed. "You should have tried harder," the ghost said. "I tried everything," she whispered. "Not everything. You could have been stronger. I didn't know how. Then you deserve this." The ghost dissolved into heat shimmer and she was alone again, stumbling over rocks she couldn't quite see, her vision blurring at the edges. The sun was a tyrant overhead, crushing her into the sand 1 degree at a time. She thought about dying. It would be easy. Just stop walking, lie down in the sand and let the heat finish what the Empire started. No more struggling, no more pain, no more being the thing everyone pitied or mocked or rejected. But something in her refused. Maybe it was spite. Maybe it was the last ember of virile pride burning in her chest. Maybe it was just the stubborn animal part of her brain that didn't understand how to quit. She kept walking. Night brought different terrors. The temperature plummeted so fast she thought her bones might crack. She found a shallow depression between 2 boulders and curled into it, shivering so hard her teeth rattled. The stars came out, more than she'd ever seen from the palace. A blanket of light that would have been beautiful if she wasn't dying. Sounds carried differently in the dark. Every scrape of wind against rock became a predator stalking closer. Every distant howl, and there were many, reminded her that she was prey now. Not a wolf, not even a woman, really, just meat that hadn't been eaten yet. She slept in fragments, waking every few minutes in panic, certain something was standing over her. Nothing ever was. Somehow, that was worse. Dawn came like a punishment. Liarine couldn't stand at first. Her muscles had locked during the night, her lips were cracked and bleeding, and her skin felt like it had been scraped raw. But she stood anyway, because the alternative was dying right here, and spite was a powerful motivator. She had no plan, no destination, just a vague sense that deeper into the wasteland meant farther from the Empire, and farther meant safer from archers or hunting parties sent to ensure she actually died. The second day, she found water. It was green and smelled like rot, pooled in a depression in the rock where something had probably died weeks ago. She stared at it for a long time, weighing death by thirst against death by poison. Thirst won. She drank it like wine, gagging on the taste but forcing it down, and then she vomited it all back up 10 minutes later. The cycle repeated 3 times before her body accepted it. By evening, she had violent cramps and diarrhea that left her weak as a newborn. But she was alive, and that was something the Empire hadn't counted on. Day 3. The hallucinations got worse. Her mother walked beside her now, dressed in the formal robes she'd worn to council meetings. Alara Varel had been beautiful in the way that dangerous things are beautiful, all sharp edges and controlled power. The hallucination captured it perfectly. "You're embarrassing the family," Hallucination Alara said calmly. Leorine laughed, the sound harsh and broken. "The family exiled me. I think the embarrassment ship has sailed. We gave you everything: training, education, the best bloodline in the Empire. You gave me expectations I couldn't meet and then punished me for your failure." "Our failure?" Alara's voice went cold. "We are not the ones without a wolf, child." "No," Leorine said, stumbling over a rock and catching herself against a boulder that burned her palm with residual heat. "You're just the ones who decided that made me worthless." The hallucination smiled, and it was the cruelest thing Leorine had ever seen. "If you survive this," her mother said, "it won't change what you are. Broken, defective, less." "Maybe," Leorine whispered, "or maybe I'm something you never had the imagination to understand." Her mother disappeared. Leorine kept walking. There's a point in every survival story where the person either breaks or evolves, where the body realizes it's not going to get rescued and starts making adaptations it didn't know were possible. Leorine hit that point on day 4. She woke before dawn, her body moving on instinct before her mind caught up. The night predators were still hunting. She could hear them, distant but closing. Without thinking, she pressed herself against a rock face and went absolutely still. Not the stillness of fear. Something else. Something deeper. Her breathing slowed. Her heartbeat quieted. And for just a moment, she felt connected to the stone at her back, part of it, invisible against it. The predator passed within 10 feet and never looked her way. After it was gone, Leorine sat there shaking, not from fear, but from the shock of what had just happened. She had no wolf, no shift, no power that the Empire would recognize. But she'd just survived something that should have killed her, and she'd done it without any of the things they said she needed. On the 4th day, she found the bones. They were everywhere once she knew to look for them, scattered across the wasteland like seeds that had failed to sprout. Human bones, wolf bones, things that might have been either or neither. Some were ancient, bleached white by sun and time. Others were newer, still held together by scraps of dried tendon. She picked up a skull, human-sized, with teeth that seemed too sharp. "What were you?" she asked it. The skull, predictably, didn't answer. But standing there, surrounded by the remains of everyone who'd been exiled before her, Leorine understood something. This wasn't just a wasteland, it was a graveyard, a dumping ground for everything the Empire deemed unworthy. How many had walked through that eastern gate? How many had died here, alone and unmourned, because they didn't fit the narrow definition of acceptable? Hundreds. Maybe thousands. She set the skull down gently, like it mattered. Maybe it did. "I'm not dying here," she told the bones. "I'm not giving them the satisfaction." The promise felt hollow in her mouth. She was barely surviving. Each day was harder than the last. Her body was eating itself, muscle turning to fuel because there was nothing else to burn. But hollow promises were better than no promises at all. The 5th day, something changed. Leorine was searching for water. Actual water, not the green poison she'd been surviving on, when she felt it. A pull. Like a string tied to her sternum, tugging her toward the northwest. It wasn't instinct, not the way the wolves described their instincts. This was older, deeper, more insistent. She tried to ignore it. Following strange pulls in a deadly wasteland seemed like a poor survival strategy. But the pull intensified until it was all she could feel, a magnetism that made her bones ache. She followed it. The landscape shifted gradually. The sand gave way to rocky ground, the rocks to scrub brush that somehow grew in soil that looked like ash. And then she saw it. A canyon carved into the wasteland, narrow and deep, shadows pooling at the bottom like spilled ink. The pull intensified until it felt like something was trying to drag her forward by her ribs. Every survival instinct she had left screamed at her to turn back. Nothing good lived in places like this. Canyons were death traps, ambush points, tombs waiting to close. But the pull was stronger than fear, stronger than sense, stronger than the voice in her head that sounded suspiciously like her mother telling her she was about to make another mistake. She climbed down. The canyon walls were close enough to touch on both sides, the stones smooth and cold despite the heat above. It should have been terrifying. Instead, it felt almost safe, protected. like the walls were keeping something out rather than keeping her in. At the bottom, she found the entrance. It was barely wide enough for a person, a crack in the canyon wall that led into absolute darkness. The pull sang in her chest now, a resonance that made her teeth ache and her vision blur at the edges. Leorine had no light, no supplies, no reason to think this was anything but a terrible idea. She went in anyway. The passage wound downward, the walls closing in until she had to turn sideways to squeeze through. Her breathing echoed off stone she couldn't see, creating sounds like whispers just out of range of understanding. Panic clawed at her throat. What if she got stuck? What if this led nowhere? What if she just crawled into her own tomb? Her hands scraped against rough stone. Her shoulders brushed walls that seemed to pulse with warmth. The darkness was absolute, the kind of black that makes you forget what light looks like. And then the passage opened. The chamber was vast, carved from some kind of crystal that glowed with its own pale light. Not bright, just enough to see by, like twilight trapped in stone. Leorine stepped into it slowly, her breathing echoing off walls that seemed to pulse with each beat of her heart. The air tasted different here. Older, like breathing in history. The center of the chamber held a pool. The water was black as ink and perfectly still. No ripples, no sound. Just an impossible circle of darkness in the middle of all that light, reflecting nothing, absorbing everything. Leorine approached it slowly. She'd been dying for 5 days. Dehydrated, starving, burning with fever from the poison water and the relentless sun. Her body was eating itself. Her mind was fragmenting. She had maybe another day left before something vital broke down and didn't come back. This water could save her, or it could finish what the desert started. She knelt beside it. Her reflection stared back at her. She looked like hell, gaunt and sunburned, her hair matted with dirt and blood, her clothes hanging off a frame that had lost too much weight too fast. But her eyes were different, harder, like something had been burned away and what remained was forged in the burning. "Don't," a voice whispered. It sounded like her mother, like Vael, like every person who'd ever told her she wasn't enough. Leorine reached out to touch the water. It reached back. The pain was instantaneous and absolute. Every nerve in her body caught fire at once. Leorine tried to scream, but the water was in her mouth, her lungs, her blood. It wasn't drowning. It was worse than drowning. It was being unmade at a molecular level, torn apart and reassembled wrong. Visions crashed through her mind like waves trying to drown her from the inside. A woman with eyes like hers, being dragged to an altar. She was screaming, but no sound came out. Crowds chanting in a language that hurt to hear. A knife rising and falling. Blood mixing with something older than blood, something that writhed and burned. The woman's power erupting in her final moment, tearing through the crowd like a scythe through wheat. And then soldiers pinning her down, cutting symbols into her skin, binding what couldn't be killed. Another woman, centuries earlier, standing on a battlefield. No wolf, no shift. Just her and her will, and the absolute conviction that reality would bend or break. She raised her hands and lightning answered, not from the sky but from her blood, from some source deeper than muscle or bone. They killed her too, burned her alive and scattered the ashes. More women. Dozens. Hundreds. A lineage of power that had nothing to do with wolves, everything to do with something older and wilder and impossible to control. Each one murdered, each one erased from history, because what couldn't be controlled had to be eliminated. And then the final vision, the truth that shattered everything she thought she knew. The wolves weren't the original power. They were the replacement, the acceptable version, the controllable version created after the original power proved too dangerous to allow. What she carried, what all these women had carried, was the source, the root, the thing the Empire had spent 1,000 years trying to breed out of existence. They called it defective because they couldn't dominate it. They called it broken because it refused to submit. They called it weak because acknowledging its strength would mean admitting their entire hierarchy was built on a lie. The water released her. Leorine collapsed on the crystal floor, coughing and shaking, every muscle in spasm. Blood ran from her nose, her ears, the corners of her eyes. Her skin felt like it had been flayed and regrown. Her bones ached like they'd been broken and reset. But underneath the pain, something was different. She could feel it in her marrow, in the spaces between her heartbeats, in the electric current running through her nervous system. She wasn't broken. She had never been broken. She was just finally awake. When she could stand again, the pool had changed. The black water now reflected something else. Not her face, but symbols. Patterns that hurt to look at directly, that seemed to shift and writhe with meaning just beyond comprehension. She recognized them. They were the same symbols that had been carved into the dying women's skin, the same patterns that had bound their power. But here, they weren't bindings, they were keys. Leorine pressed her palm to the crystal floor and felt the canyon respond. Not with sound, not with movement, with recognition, like the stone itself had been waiting for her. "What am I?" she whispered. The canyon answered in a voice that wasn't quite sound, wasn't quite thought, but something that bypassed her ears and spoke directly to her bones. "What you were always meant to be." She stayed in the canyon. Time moved differently down there, or maybe she just stopped caring about the sun's arc above the wasteland. There was water, clean water, flowing from cracks in the crystal that glowed brighter at night. There were fish in the pools, blind and pale, but edible once you got past the texture. There were chambers she hadn't found yet, passages that led deeper into mysteries she wasn't ready to face. But mostly, there was the learning. It started small, moving a pebble without touching it, making the crystal glow brighter or dimmer with focus, feeling the attention of things that lived in the deep parts of the canyon, ancient and patient and curious about the woman who'd stumbled into their home. The first time she moved the pebble, she thought it was coincidence. She was staring at it, willing it to shift, and it rolled half an inch. The second time wasn't coincidence. The third time, she moved a rock the size of her fist. By the end of the first week, she could make the crystal walls pulse in rhythm with her heartbeat. It wasn't like the stories of wolf shifters, all instinct and raw power. This was precision, control. Understanding that reality was more flexible than anyone admitted, that the space between thought and action was thinner than breath. One morning, or what felt like morning, there was no real day or night down here, Leorine woke to find symbols carved into her skin. Not cuts, not tattoos, just markings that appeared and disappeared like writing on fogged glass, patterns that matched the ones in the pool. She didn't panic. Panic was a luxury from her old life. Instead, she traced them with her fingers and felt knowledge bloom in her mind. Not words, not language, just understanding, appearing fully formed like it had always been there, and she'd just forgotten how to access it, how to pull moisture from the air when there was no water source, how to read the intentions of living things before they acted, how to make her presence felt in ways that had nothing to do with size or strength, or the ability to shift into something with claws, how to survive in a world that wanted her dead. But survival wasn't enough. Not anymore. She began to practice in earnest. The canyon became her training ground, her temple, her forge. She learned to move without sound, to sense vibrations through stone before her ears registered them, to know when something was hunting her before it got close enough to be a threat. The deep-dwelling things, she never saw them clearly, just shapes in the peripheral darkness, movement in her blind spots, became her teachers. They tested her, stalked her, forced her to adapt or die. One attacked her on the 7th day. She felt it coming, a presence in the dark that radiated hunger and ancient patience. No warning, no mercy. Just the sudden knowledge that something was coming for her, and it was faster and stronger and had been hunting in these tunnels since before her bloodline existed. Old Leorine would have frozen. New Leorine moved. She didn't think. Thinking took time she didn't have. She just acted, her body responding to instincts that weren't wolf-born but were no less powerful. She dropped low, rolled left, and when the thing passed overhead, all scales and teeth and too many limbs, she struck. Not with her hands, with will. The crystal walls shattered, sending shards into the creature's flank. It screamed, a sound that made her ears bleed, and retreated into the deep dark. Leorine stood there shaking, covered in crystal dust and the thing's black blood, and realized something crucial. She could fight. Not like a wolf, not like anything the Empire would recognize, but she could fight. After 2 weeks, maybe 3, time blurred when every day was the same endless practice, she found the armory. It was in a chamber she'd passed a dozen times without noticing, hidden behind a curtain of crystal so thin it looked like hanging water. The moment she touched it, the curtain dissolved. Inside, weapons older than the Empire hung on walls of pure shadow. Not steel, not iron, nothing she recognized from the palace armories or the training yards where she'd watched wolf warriors spar. These were something else entirely. Forged from will and darkness and the kind of patience that measures time in centuries. Each one hummed with potential, with purpose, with the echo of everyone who'd wielded it before. She reached for a blade. It was light as breath and sharp as betrayal. The moment her fingers closed around the hilt, the symbols on her skin burned bright enough to illuminate the entire chamber. The blade sang, not with sound, with recognition, with welcome, with the same bone-deep certainty that had pulled her into this canyon in the first place. "Who made you?" she asked it. The blade hummed with something like satisfaction, and knowledge flooded into her mind. She had made it, would make it, was making it in this moment and every moment, past and future collapsing into a single point where will became substance. Time meant different things down here. Leorine didn't understand, not fully, but she was starting to. She took the blade and began to train in earnest. Days blurred into weeks. Weeks might have been months. She stopped counting, stopped caring about anything except the next movement, the next technique, the next impossible thing she could learn to make possible. The deep dwellers became her sparring partners. They were vicious and unforgiving and never held back. She collected scars, learned lessons written in pain and near-death experiences. But she got faster, stronger, more precise. Not physically stronger. Her body was still recovering from near starvation, but stronger in the ways that mattered down here. Her will became iron. Her focus became absolute. Her understanding of how reality worked deepened until she could feel the foundations underneath the everyday world. She learned to fight multiple opponents at once, to use the environment as a weapon, to turn her weaknesses into advantages. Being small meant being fast, being quiet, being underestimated. Let them underestimate her. It would be the last mistake they ever made. One day, and she knew it was the last day, could feel it in her bones like weather changing, she climbed back to the surface. The wasteland hit her like a greeting from an old enemy. Still brutal, still trying to kill her. But now she felt different underneath it, solid, real. Not despite her lack of a wolf, but because of what she had instead. The sun didn't crush her anymore. The heat was just heat. The danger was just danger. She had survived worse in the dark below. She walked northwest, following that same pull that had led her to the canyon. It was weaker on the surface, diluted by sunlight and open air, but still there. A compass pointing toward something she couldn't name yet. Toward her future, maybe. Or toward everyone who'd tried to erase it. The first settlement she found was barely worthy of the name. 20 people, maybe, living in structures built from scavenged empire materials and desperation. Lean-tos made from broken carts, tents patched with rags, a communal fire pit surrounded by rocks that had been arranged with more hope than skill. They watched her approach with the hollow eyes of those who'd given up on hope months ago. An old man stepped forward. He was missing one arm and most of his teeth, his face weathered like stone left too long in the elements. But his spine was straight and his eyes were sharp. "You lost?" he asked. "No," Leorine said. "Are you?" He barked a laugh that turned into a cough. "Lost implies there's somewhere to be found. We're just here. Exiled, like you're about to be if you don't turn around. I've already been exiled." That stopped him. He looked her over more carefully, taking in the rough clothes, the lean muscle, the way she stood like someone who'd forgotten how to be afraid. "What did you do?" he asked. Didn't shift. Murmurs ran through the small crowd that had gathered. They knew what that meant. Ultimate failure in the Empire's eyes. Death sentence in the wasteland. The old man studied her for a long moment. "You don't look like you're dying. I'm not planning to. Plans and reality rarely match out here, girl." Leorine met his eyes and let him see what she'd become in the dark below the world. "Then I'll change reality." Something flickered in his expression. Not quite belief. Maybe the memory of what belief felt like, buried under years of survival and resignation. "You got a name?" he asked. "Leorine Varel." The crowd reacted like she'd struck them. Varel. The bloodline that had given the Empire 6 generations of queens. And here was one of them, standing in exile rags in a wasteland settlement, claiming she'd change reality. The old man's expression shifted. "Well, that's either the bravest or stupidest thing I've heard in a decade. Which is it?" Leorine smiled, and it felt like the first real smile she'd managed in months. The kind of smile that had teeth in it. "Stay and find out," she said. "Give me a month." The old man, his name was Karth, she learned later, laughed again. This time, it didn't turn into a cough. "A month," he agreed. "And if you're still alive at the end of it, maybe I'll start believing in miracles again." Leorine looked at the settlement, at the people who'd been discarded by the Empire just like her, At the survivors who'd somehow kept breathing despite everything trying to kill them. Not miracles, she said. Just reality, recognizing what it tried to erase. And in that moment, standing in a wasteland settlement under a brutal sun, surrounded by the Empire's rejects and outcasts, Leorine Varel felt something she hadn't felt since the throne room. Purpose. Not the purpose they tried to force on her, not the destiny of becoming some king's acceptable queen, but something older, wilder, uncontrollable. The purpose of a woman who'd died in the wasteland and been reborn in the dark, who'd learned to fight without a wolf and survive without a pack, who'd discovered she was never broken, just suppressed. The purpose of a woman who would return to the empire that rejected her, not as a bride, as a reckoning. Karth was still watching her, his expression caught between skepticism and something that might have been hope trying to remember how to exist. 1 month, he said again. Leorine nodded. She didn't tell him that a month was generous, that she could feel the pull still tugging at her, pointing back toward the empire, toward the throne room where she'd been humiliated, toward the king who'd discarded her. She didn't tell him that every moment she stayed here was just preparation for what came next. She didn't tell him that in the dark below the canyon, she'd seen visions of the future, of herself walking into the capital, of Vale's face when he realized what he'd created by rejecting her. She didn't tell him any of that. She just smiled and said, "Get some rest, old man. Tomorrow we start building something the Empire won't be able to ignore." And far away, in the throne room of the Obsidian Empire, King Vael Drakkar sat on his throne and felt something he'd never felt before. A chill down his spine that had nothing to do with temperature, a whisper of consequence approaching. The first tremor of understanding that rejection doesn't eliminate a threat, it just removes it from sight long enough to evolve into something far more dangerous. He dismissed the feeling. That was his first mistake. His last would come later, when the woman he'd discarded walked back through his gates, and he realized too late that he'd rejected not a defect, but the only thing in the Empire that could unmake him. The settlement called Ashfall woke to the sound of Leorine moving through it like a storm with purpose. She didn't announce herself, didn't gather everyone for some grand speech. That was Empire thinking, the belief that change required ceremony and approval from those it would affect. She just started working. Karth found her an hour after dawn, crouched beside the communal fire pit with her hands pressed flat against the ash-covered ground. Her eyes were closed. Sweat beaded on her forehead despite the morning chill. "What are you doing?" he asked. "Finding water. We've got water, that green poison 2 miles west." Leorine opened her eyes. The symbols on her skin, visible now in the early light, pulsed once and went dark. "That's not water. That's desperation in liquid form." She stood, brushing ash from her palms, and pointed to a spot 30 feet from the fire pit. "Dig there, 4 feet down. You'll hit a spring that's been trying to surface for the last decade." Karth stared at her like she'd grown a second head. "How do you know that?" I asked the ground. It answered. The old man's face went through several expressions before settling on something between skepticism and the kind of desperate hope that people feel right before disappointment crushes them again. "We don't have tools for digging. Lost them in a sandstorm 3 months back." "Then we make tools." Leorine walked to the edge of the settlement where scrap materials were piled. Broken cartwheels, shattered pottery, pieces of Empire refuse that had blown this far into the wasteland. She sorted through it with the focus of someone reading a language only she understood. She picked up a piece of metal. It had been part of a spear once, before rust and time had reduced it to a jagged edge attached to nothing useful. She held it up to the light, turning it slowly, and Karth watched her lips move in words too quiet to hear. The metal straightened, not all at once, not with the dramatic flare of Empire magic. It just gradually remembered what it used to be. The rust flaking away, the edge sharpening, until Leorine held a functional spade where moments before there'd been scrap. She handed it to Karth. His hand shook when he took it. "Start digging," she said. 4 feet. Don't stop when you hit wet soil. That's just the beginning." The old man looked at the spade. At Leorine. At the spot she'd indicated. When he spoke, his voice was rougher than usual. "Who taught you this?" "No one," Leorine said. "And everyone who died trying to use it before the Empire erased them from history." She walked away before he could ask what that meant. By midday, water was flowing. Not the green poison from the western pools. Clean water, cold and clear, bubbling up from stone that hadn't felt moisture in living memory. The settlement gathered around it like pilgrims at a shrine, their faces reflecting something that looked dangerously close to belief. Leorine stood back and watched them drink. Watched them cry. Watched them fill every container they had and then drink more, like they were trying to wash away months of barely surviving on liquid that made you sicker than thirst. A woman approached her. Young, maybe 19, with scars across her throat that suggested someone had tried to silence her permanently and failed. She didn't speak. Couldn't, probably, but she pressed something into Leorine's hand. A wooden carving, crude but careful, a wolf with wings. Leorine looked at it, then at the woman. "What's this?" The woman made a gesture, pointed at Leorine, pointed at the carving, pointed at the sky. Karth translated from behind them. "She's saying you're what we were told couldn't exist. Power without a wolf. She's saying you're proof they lied to us." Leorine closed her fingers around the carving. "Tell her I'm just the first. There will be more." The woman's eyes widened. She nodded once, sharp and certain, and walked away. Karth stayed. "You realize what you're doing here? Giving them water?" "No." The old man's voice was quiet. "You're giving them something more dangerous than that. You're giving them hope. And hope in a place like this either saves people or destroys them when it proves false." Leorine met his eyes. "Then I better make sure it's not false." She spent the next week teaching them to survive. Not the way the Empire taught survival, through dominance and hierarchy, and the assumption that strength was the only thing that mattered. She taught them the lessons she'd learned in the canyon, in the dark, in the space between dying and discovering she'd never been alive the right way to begin with. How to read the land. How to sense water before you saw it. How to move through the wasteland without fighting it, without trying to conquer it, just flowing with it until you became part of its rhythm instead of its enemy. Some of them got it immediately. Others struggled, their minds too shaped by Empire thinking to accept that power could come from anywhere except the wolf inside them. A man named Torvin was the worst. He'd been a low-ranking soldier before getting exiled for questioning an order that would have gotten his entire unit killed. He had the wolf still, could shift, could fight, but out here, away from the pack structure that gave his power meaning, he was just another exile trying not to starve. "This is useless," he said on the third day, after Leorine had spent an hour trying to teach him to feel vibrations through stone. "We need to raid Empire outposts, take what we need, not sit here pretending rocks can talk." Leorine looked at him. Really looked. The way she'd learned to in the canyon, seen past the surface to the fear underneath. "And you think that'll work? 20 exiles with improvised weapons against trained Empire soldiers? We've got wolves. They don't expect us to fight back. They don't expect you to survive at all. That's different from not being ready for you." She stood, brushing sand from her hands. "But go ahead, raid an outpost, see what happens." Torvin's jaw tightened. "You saying I'm wrong? I'm saying you're thinking like someone who still believes the Empire's definition of strength is the only one that matters. And until you stop doing that, you'll always be what they made you. Disposable." The blow came fast. Torvin was a soldier, trained in combat, and his fist should have connected with her jaw hard enough to drop her. Should have. Leorine moved, not away, through. She flowed around his punch like water around stone, and suddenly she was behind him with her hand pressed against the base of his skull. Torvin froze. He couldn't help it. Every instinct he had was screaming that he was one wrong move from death, even though Leorine hadn't hurt him, hadn't even applied pressure, just touched him in a way that made his wolf whimper and retreat. "You're fast," Leorine said quietly, "strong, well-trained, and right now you couldn't move if your life depended on it." "Why?" Torvin's voice came out strangled. "What did you do? I understood you better than you understand yourself." She released him, stepping back. That's the power the Empire doesn't teach. Not dominating, understanding, reading intention before it becomes action. And once you understand something completely, controlling it is just a matter of pressure in the right places. She walked away, leaving Torvin standing there with his wolf howling in confusion and something that might have been respect starting to bloom in his chest. After that, they paid attention. Word spread faster than Leorine expected. The wasteland had its own communication network, she discovered. Exiles who traveled between settlements, trading information for food or shelter. Within 2 weeks, people started arriving at Ashfall from places she'd never heard of. They came alone at first, then in pairs, then in groups. A woman who'd lost her wolf in childbirth and been exiled for it, left to die because the Empire considered her used up. A man whose wolf had never emerged, born defective in a family of warriors. Children who'd been dumped in the wasteland because their parents were exiles, and the Empire didn't waste resources on exile spawn. Every one of them had been told they were worthless. Every one of them had survived anyway. Leorine looked at them and saw what the Empire refused to. Not weakness, not defects, just people who'd been punished for not fitting into a system designed to serve the powerful. She taught them everything she knew: how to find water in stone, how to move without sound, how to read intention in the shift of weight, the direction of a glance, the tempo of breathing, how to fight without relying on the wolf, using leverage and precision and the understanding that everybody has weak points if you know where to look. And slowly, carefully, she taught them the deeper things. The things she'd learned in the canyon. How reality was more flexible than they'd been told. How could shape substance if you understood the relationship between them. How power didn't come from dominance, but from alignment with forces older than the Empire, older than wolves, old as the earth itself. Not everyone could do it. Some people's minds were too rigid, too shaped by Empire doctrine, but enough could. Enough learned to move small objects with focus. Enough learned to sense water underground. Enough learned to do impossible things that would have gotten them killed in the Empire for being uncontrollable. By the end of the first month, Ashfall had 50 people. By the end of the second, it had 120. And in the throne room of the Obsidian Empire, King Vael Drakkar was starting to hear whispers that made his wolf pace with unease. The council met in the war room where strategy was discussed and enemies were dissected. Vael sat at the head of the table, his generals arranged on either side like teeth in a predator's jaw. They were reporting on border security, trade routes, the endless small conflicts that kept an empire running. He wasn't listening. His mind kept circling back to a feeling he couldn't name, a pressure at the base of his skull that had been building for weeks. His wolf felt it too, restless and aggressive in a way that had nothing to do with territorial disputes or mating season. Something was wrong. He just didn't know what yet. General Kavros was speaking, his voice a low rumble. Increased activity in the eastern wastelands. Scouts report settlements appearing where there should only be bones. Vael's attention snapped into focus. Settlements? Small ones. Exiles banding together instead of dying like they're supposed to. Kavros shrugged. Nothing to concern yourself with, my king. The wasteland will kill them soon enough. How many? Kavros hesitated. Last count was 5 settlements, maybe 300 total. Mostly the usual, wolfless, criminals, political inconveniences. 300 people who should be dead aren't dead. That seems like something to concern myself with. The general's jaw tightened. We can send a cleanup force if you'd like. Remind them why they were exiled. Vael considered it. 300 people scattered across the wasteland shouldn't matter. They were no threat to the Empire, no threat to his rule, just refuse that hadn't decomposed on schedule. But that pressure at the base of his skull intensified. Who's leading them? He asked. No one, as far as we know. They're just survival clusters. No organization, no leadership, just desperation making them cling to each other. Find out for sure, Vael said. I want to know everything about these settlements. Numbers, resources, and especially any names we might recognize. Because something in him, some instinct older than thought, whispered that this mattered more than it should, that somewhere in those wasteland settlements, something he'd discarded was refusing to stay discarded. Kavros nodded. As you command. The meeting continued, but Vael's mind was elsewhere, circling that pressure, that unease, trying to identify the source of a threat he couldn't see yet. This is what separates good rulers from great ones. Good rulers react to threats they can see. Great rulers sense the ones still forming in the dark, still gathering strength, still deciding whether to strike or retreat. Vael had always been great. But greatness requires you to trust your instincts even when they don't make sense. And his instincts were screaming that something in the wasteland was evolving into a problem he should have eliminated months ago. 3 weeks later, Kavros returned with a report. Vael read it in his private chambers, away from the council, away from advisors who would want to discuss and debate and turn information into politics. The settlements had grown. 5 had become 8. 300 had become 500, and they weren't just surviving anymore. They were thriving. Wells had appeared in the wasteland where there should be no water. Structures were being built from materials that shouldn't exist out there. And the exiles themselves were different, healthier, stronger, organized in ways that suggested leadership even though the scouts couldn't identify who was leading. Vial read through casualty reports. 2 scouting parties had been attacked, not killed, carefully disabled, and sent back with messages carved into their skin. We are not your refuse. We are what you discarded. And we remember. The handwriting was elegant, educated, the kind of script taught to noble children. Vale's hands tightened on the parchment. At the bottom of the report, Kavros had added a note in his own hand. One name keeps appearing in exile testimonies. They call her the Returned. Description matches a woman exiled 4 months ago. Varel bloodline, no confirmed wolf. You may remember her. The parchment tore in Vael's grip. He remembered. A girl in white silk standing in the throne room, trying so hard to be brave while her world collapsed. He'd called her defective, broken, a mutation to be cut out. He'd exiled her to die, and she'd had the audacity to survive. More than survive. Apparently she'd built something in the wasteland, gathered the Empire's refuse around her, turned survival into organization, organization into threat. Vael stood and walked to the window overlooking his empire. Black spires stretching toward a sky that belonged to him. Streets filled with wolves who bent their necks in submission when he passed. Power consolidated through generations of careful breeding and ruthless elimination of weakness. He'd built this. And some wolfless girl thought she could challenge it from a wasteland? The laugh that escaped him was harsh. Let her try. Let her gather every exile, every outcast, every defective bloodline. Numbers meant nothing without strength. Organization meant nothing without power. And she had no wolf, which meant she had nothing that mattered. But even as he thought it, that pressure at the base of his skull intensified until it felt like something was trying to crack his bones from the inside. His wolf snarled, not in anger, in warning. Predator. Recognizing predator. Vael dismissed it. Instinct was useful, but it wasn't infallible. Sometimes wolves sensed threats that didn't exist. Phantom dangers conjured from too much peace making them restless. That's all this was. Paranoia over nothing. He returned to the report and began planning. Not an attack. Not yet. That would be overkill, would make him look threatened by someone who posed no real danger. Just increase patrols. Tighter border security, and quiet orders to make sure any exile caught trying to return to the Empire was executed immediately. Standard procedure. Nothing to worry about. In Ashfall, Leorine woke from a vision that left her shaking. She'd seen the throne room, seen Vael reading reports about her, seen the exact moment his expression shifted from dismissal to something colder. He knew she was alive, and he was planning, not an attack. Not yet. He was too smart for that. Too careful to waste resources on something he still considered beneath him. But he was paying attention now, which meant the timeline had just accelerated. Karth found her sitting by the central well, staring at nothing. You all right? Leorine blinked, pulling herself back to the present. He knows. Who knows what? Vael, he knows I'm alive. He knows about the settlements. She looked at the old man. We're on borrowed time now. Karth lowered himself to sit beside her, his missing arm making the movement awkward but practiced. You knew this would happen eventually. Can't build something out of the Empire's discards without them noticing. I was hoping for more time. Time for what? To be ready. Ready for what? Karth's voice was gentle. What's the end game here, girl? You gathering an army? Planning to march on the Empire? Because I like you, but I've seen what happens to people who think they can challenge an empire with good intentions and makeshift weapons. Leorine was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was steady. I'm not challenging the Empire. I'm becoming the thing it can't ignore. The proof that everything it's built on is a lie. That's the same thing. No. Challenging assumes you're playing by their rules, fighting for legitimacy within their system. I'm not doing that. She turned to look at him. I'm building an alternative, a demonstration that power doesn't require their definition of strength, that the people they discard aren't weak, just incompatible with a system designed to serve those already powerful. Karth studied her face. That's a fancy way of saying rebellion. Rebellion suggests, I want what they have. I don't want their throne. I want to make it irrelevant. The old man laughed, rough and genuine. Now that's ambitious. Also probably impossible. Also definitely going to get a lot of people killed. Probably, Leorine agreed. So anyone who wants to leave should leave now. Before this becomes the kind of fight where walking away isn't an option anymore. And you? You gonna walk away? Leorine looked at the settlement they'd built. 50 structures now, ranging from solid to aspirational. 500 people, maybe more. She'd stopped counting. Wells flowing with clean water, gardens starting to grow in soil they'd coaxed into fertility, children playing instead of just surviving, exiles building lives instead of waiting to die. No, she said, I'm going to finish what they started when they decided I was disposable. Karth nodded slowly. Then I guess I'm staying too. Someone needs to make sure you don't get yourself killed doing something stupidly heroic. I'm not heroic. I know, that's what worries me. Heroes die for causes. But people like you live long enough to make everyone regret underestimating you. He stood, offered her his remaining hand, and pulled her to her feet. Come on, he said. If we're about to pick a fight with an empire, we should probably make sure everyone knows what they're signing up for. That night, Leorine gathered the settlement. She didn't call it a meeting, didn't frame it as a decision point. She just stood in the central square and started speaking, and people came because by now they'd learned that when she spoke, it mattered. The Empire knows we exist, she said without preamble. They're watching, planning, and soon they'll decide whether we're a threat worth eliminating or just an embarrassment to be ignored until we collapse on our own. Murmurs ran through the crowd. Fear, anger, the complicated mix of emotions that comes from being hunted by the same people who already tried to kill you once. Leorine waited for quiet. Here's what you need to understand, she continued. We're not a threat because of our numbers. We're not a threat because of our weapons or our organization. We're a threat because we exist. Because every day we survive is proof that the Empire's definition of worth is arbitrary. That the people they call defective, broken, weak, we're none of those things. We're just incompatible with a system that requires us to be less than we are. A woman in the crowd spoke up. So what do we do? Hide better? Run further into the wasteland? No, Leorine said. We become undeniable. We build something so visible, so functional, so clearly thriving that the Empire can't dismiss us as refuse that forgot to die. We force them to acknowledge that their hierarchy is a choice, not a law of nature. And we offer every exile, every outcast, every person they've discarded an alternative. Torvin pushed forward. You're talking about war. I'm talking about existence as resistance. We don't have to attack the Empire. We just have to refuse to disappear. And that refusal, maintained long enough and visibly enough, is more dangerous to them than any army. Because systems built on lies can tolerate opposition. They're designed for it, ready for it, good at crushing it. But what they can't tolerate is proof that the lies aren't necessary, that there's another way. The crowd was silent now, listening, calculating what she was asking them to risk. Some of you are thinking this is suicide, Leorine said, that we're exiles with nothing, and they're an empire with everything. You're right. By their metrics, we should lose, but their metrics only work if we fight the way they expect. Strength against strength, wolf against wolf, dominance against submission. She let the words settle. We're not going to do that. We're going to fight the way they can't predict, with survival that shouldn't be possible, with power that doesn't fit their definitions, with existence that proves their entire hierarchy is built on the decision to value one kind of strength and erase all others. Will people die? Probably. Will this be hard? Absolutely. But ask yourself, what's the alternative? Keep hiding in the wasteland, hoping they forget about us? Scatter and try to survive alone? Go back to believing what they told us about ourselves? She met their eyes, one by one. Or do we build something that makes the Empire's rejection irrelevant? That demonstrates we were never broken, just measured by the wrong standards? The silence stretched. Then the woman who'd given Leorine the wooden carving stepped forward. She couldn't speak, but she didn't need to. She just stood beside Leorine, facing the crowd, her stance making her position clear. Others followed. Torvin came next, his jaw set. I still think you're crazy, but I'm tired of running, so I'm in. Karth limped up, grinning. Someone has to keep the crazy ones from getting killed too quickly. One by one, the exiles stepped forward. Not all of them. Some drifted to the edges of the crowd, making themselves smaller, already planning their escape. Leorine didn't stop them. Fear was rational. Survival was rational. What she was asking for was neither. But by the time the crowd dispersed, 3/4 of the settlement had committed to staying, to building, to existing as loudly and visibly as possible, consequences be damned. Leorine stood in the empty square after everyone left, feeling the weight of what she'd just done. She'd given them hope, and hope, wielded properly, was the most dangerous weapon in existence. The next morning, she started training them in earnest. Not survival anymore. Strategy, combat. The deeper mysteries she'd learned in the canyon, teaching them to those who could grasp it, adapting it for those who couldn't. She divided them into groups based on ability, not hierarchy. Those who could manipulate reality through will became scouts and specialists. Those who still had their wolves became the visible force, the expected threat. Those who had neither became support, logistics, the invisible architecture that made everything else possible. And she taught them all the same core lesson. The Empire expects you to be weak because you don't fit their definition of strong. Use that. Let them underestimate you until the moment you prove they should have paid attention. Weeks blurred into months. The settlements grew. 8 became 12. 500 became 1,000. And the wasteland itself seemed to respond, becoming less hostile, more cooperative, like it recognized kindred spirits in people who'd been cast out by those who claimed to own it. Leorine felt herself changing too. The girl who'd stood in the throne room and begged for acceptance was gone. In her place was someone harder, sharper, more certain. Someone who'd learned that power didn't require permission, that legitimacy was just another word for approved by those already powerful. She didn't need approval. She just needed to exist loudly enough that silence wasn't an option. In the Empire, Vael's unease grew into something darker. The reports kept coming, settlements thriving, exiles organizing, and at the center of it all, one name appearing over and over. Leorine Vael, the wolfless bride he'd discarded. His generals wanted to attack, crush the settlements before they became a real threat. But Vael held back, and he couldn't fully articulate why. Maybe it was pride. Attacking would acknowledge she mattered, would elevate her from exile to enemy, giving her a legitimacy she didn't deserve. Maybe it was curiosity. What could a wolfless woman possibly build in the wasteland that warranted his attention? Or maybe it was that pressure at the base of his skull, now constant, now screaming at him that this wasn't a threat he could crush with conventional force. That somewhere in the wasteland, the woman he'd rejected had become something his instincts recognized as dangerous, even though his logic insisted it was impossible. 3 months after Leorine's speech in Ashfall, a patrol returned to the Empire with a message. Not carved into skin this time, carved into stone. A pillar 10 feet tall, erected at the exact point where wasteland became Empire territory. And on it, in that same elegant script, words that would reach Vael within hours and keep him awake for nights after. To the Obsidian Empire and its king, who values strength above understanding, we are the people you discarded. We do not ask for your acknowledgement. We do not require your acceptance. We simply exist, and our existence is proof that your hierarchy is preference disguised as law. You called us broken, defective, weak, but we are building something in the places you thought could sustain no life. We are thriving in the spaces you reserved for death. And every day we survive is another crack in the foundation of everything you claim to rule. We are not your enemy. We are your consequence. And consequences, once set in motion, cannot be exiled. Below the words, a symbol Vael didn't recognize. Something older than the Empire. Older than wolves. And at the very bottom, a signature. Leorine Vael, first of the returned. When Vael read it, his wolf howled. Not in rage. In recognition of a challenge that had just crossed from implicit to explicit, from ignorable to unavoidable, from exile to declaration. The king stood in his war room, surrounded by generals waiting for orders, and felt the exact moment when this stopped being something he could dismiss and became something he would have to answer. The moment when his rejection of a wolfless bride transformed into the defining conflict of his reign. And in the wasteland, Leorine felt that same moment through the connection she'd learned to maintain with the stone pillar. Felt Vael's fury, his confusion, his dawning realization that he'd made a mistake months ago that was only now revealing its full cost. She smiled. Not in triumph. Not yet. But in the cold satisfaction of someone who'd just moved the first piece in a game her opponent didn't realize had already started. Who just forced a king to acknowledge that the girl he'd discarded as worthless was now the only thing in his empire capable of unmaking everything he'd built. The point of no return had arrived, and neither of them could walk away now. The stone pillar stood for 3 days before Vael sent his answer. It came at dawn, delivered by a single rider carrying a sealed message and a wolf's skull still wet with blood. The rider didn't speak, just handed the package to the first exile he encountered, and rode back toward the Empire at a pace that suggested fear was a better motivator than orders. Leorine opened the message in front of the entire settlement. Her hands didn't shake. That was important. Leaders couldn't afford trembling hands when their people were watching for signs of weakness, for confirmation that the Empire's response would be what they all feared. The parchment was thick, expensive, the kind used for official declarations. Vale's handwriting was angular and precise, each letter formed with the kind of control that comes from a lifetime of never allowing anything about yourself to be soft. The message was short. You have 7 days to disband your settlements and scatter back into the wasteland where you belong. Every exile who surrenders will be granted swift death instead of what they deserve. Those who resist will learn why mercy is a luxury the strong occasionally grant, not a right the weak can demand. You call yourself first of the returned. I call you a mistake I should have corrected permanently. Consider this your opportunity to prove you're smarter than you are brave. Signed, Vael Drakar, King of the Obsidian Empire, Alpha of Alphas, and the last face you'll see if you choose war. Leorine read it aloud, her voice carrying across the square. When she finished, the silence was absolute. Then Karth laughed. It started as a chuckle and built into something that sounded half mad, the kind of laughter that comes from people who've already lost everything and found freedom in having nothing left to protect. 7 days, the old man wheezed. He gives us 7 whole days to be terrified. How generous! Others joined in. Not everyone. Some looked genuinely afraid, and Leorine didn't blame them. Fear was the rational response to an empire declaring you had a week to choose between death and worse. But enough people laughed that the fear couldn't take root and spread. Leorine let them settle before speaking. He thinks we're going to scatter, run deeper into the wasteland, and hope he forgets about us. Are we? Someone called out. No. Leorine folded the message carefully. We're going to do exactly what we said we'd do. Exist, build, prove that his definition of worth is arbitrary. She looked around at faces that had become familiar over months of shared survival. And we're going to make him come to us. Because the moment he has to leave his empire and enter the wasteland to deal with us, he's already lost. Torvin pushed forward, his expression grim. You're talking about a siege. We don't have walls. We don't have weapons that can match Empire steel. And we definitely don't have enough fighters to hold against a real attack. You're right, Leorine said. By every conventional measure, we should lose. But conventional measures assume conventional warfare. She smiled, and there was nothing warm in it. And there's nothing conventional about what we've built here. The preparation began immediately. Leorine divided the settlements into teams, each with specific tasks. Some focused on fortifications, not walls, which would be obvious and attackable, but traps hidden in the sand, pressure points in the rock that could be triggered to create avalanches, water channels that could be diverted to turn solid ground into quicksand. Others worked on evacuation routes. Ways to move the children, the injured, the non-combatants deeper into the wasteland if the fighting got too close. Hidden caches of supplies scattered across the territory so that even if the main settlements fell, survivors would have resources to rebuild. And a select few, the ones who'd proven capable of grasping the deeper mysteries, trained with Leorine in techniques that would make Empire soldiers question reality itself. How to make yourself invisible by convincing the observer's mind that you're supposed to be there. How to read muscle tension and predict attacks before they happen. How to turn an opponent's strength against them using leverage and precision instead of matching force with force. It wasn't magic, though it looked like it to those who didn't understand. It was just a different relationship with reality. One that acknowledged power came from understanding, not dominance. The days blurred together in a haze of preparation and mounting tension. On the 5th day, scouts reported Empire forces gathering at the eastern border. Not a small patrol. An army. 3,000 soldiers, maybe more, all of them with wolves, all of them trained to view exiles as something less than human. Karth found Leorine standing on the ridge overlooking Ashfall, watching the sunset paint the wasteland in shades of blood and copper. 3,000, he said without preamble. Against our what, 800 who can actually fight? Those aren't odds. That's a massacre waiting to happen. Leorine didn't look at him. Numbers only matter if both sides are playing the same game. And what game are we playing? Survival as demonstration. We don't have to win. We just have to last long enough that the Empire's victory looks like a problem instead of a solution. Karth was quiet for a moment. You know some of us are going to die. Yes. And you're okay with that? No. Leorine's voice was flat. But I'm okay with giving them the choice. Stay and fight for the right to exist on their own terms, or run and keep surviving on the Empire's terms. Either way, it's their decision. The old man nodded slowly. You've changed. The girl who walked into this wasteland 4 months ago wouldn't have been able to make that calculation. That girl died in a canyon. Leorine finally looked at him. What's left is whatever survived the drowning. On the 6th day, something happened that Leorine didn't expect. Messengers arrived from 2 other exile settlements, both larger than Ashfall. They brought fighters, supplies, and a message that made Leorine's chest tighten with something that felt dangerously close to hope. Word had spread about the stone pillar, about the declaration, about exiles finally refusing to stay exiled quietly. And settlements across the wasteland had decided that if the Empire was coming for one group of returners, it was eventually coming for all of them. Better to fight together than die separately. By sunset on the 6th day, Ashfall's 800 had become 1,500, still outnumbered 2 to 1, still outmatched in conventional terms, but no longer alone. Leorine stood before them that night, looking at faces from settlements she'd never visited, people who'd survived their own hells and chosen to risk everything for a cause that wasn't even theirs. I won't lie to you, she said. Tomorrow, the Empire comes, and they're coming with overwhelming force, with training and weapons, and the absolute certainty that we're less than they are. They expect us to break, to run, to prove that exile means erasure. She paused, letting the weight settle. We're going to prove them wrong. Not by matching their strength, not by becoming what they are, but by demonstrating that survival itself, maintained in the face of everything designed to eliminate it, is a form of power they can't comprehend. That existence, loud and visible and undeniable, is more dangerous to their hierarchy than any army. Will some of us die? Yes. Will this be the hardest thing any of us have ever done? Absolutely. But ask yourself, would you rather die fighting for the right to define your own worth, or live convinced you're as worthless as they claim? The roar that answered her shook the wasteland. Dawn on the 7th day came with the sound of drums. The Empire's army appeared on the horizon like a dark stain spreading across the sand, perfectly organized, perfectly disciplined. 3,000 wolves moving in formation, their armor catching the early light, their weapons sharp and ready. At their head rode General Kavros, his face carved from stone, his wolf barely contained beneath his skin. He stopped at speaking distance from Ashfall's makeshift fortifications and raised his hand. The drums fell silent. Leorine walked forward to meet him, alone. Unarmed except for the blade from the canyon, which hung at her hip more for comfort than utility. Kavros looked her over, his expression shifting from contempt to something more complicated. So you're the famous Leorine Varel, the wolfless bride who thinks she can build an empire in the wasteland. I'm not building an empire, Leorine said. I'm building an alternative to yours. There is no alternative. There's only strength and weakness, dominance and submission. You're weak. Therefore, you submit or die. By your definition of strength, I should have died months ago. She met his eyes. Yet here I am, which means either your definition is wrong or I'm something you don't have categories for. Kavros's jaw tightened. The king offers you one final chance. Disband, scatter, and he'll make your deaths quick. Tell the king I offer him a chance too. Leave the wasteland. Stop trying to define worth for people who reject his metrics. And maybe, eventually, his empire won't collapse under the weight of its own lies. The general's laugh was harsh. You think you're the first exile to dream of revolution? You're not even the first this year. They all end the same way. Blood in the sand and bones for the scavengers. Maybe, Leorine said quietly, or maybe I'm the first one who understands that this isn't about revolution. It's about demonstration, proof of concept. You can kill us, but you can't kill what we represent. And every exile who hears about this will know that someone tried, that someone stood up and said no. That's all you want? To be a martyr for a cause that'll die with you? I want to be a crack in the foundation. And cracks, given time and pressure, bring down empires. Kavros stared at her for a long moment. Then he turned his horse and rode back to his lines. The attack came an hour later. It started with arrows. Hundreds of them, blotting out the sun, falling toward Ashfall like deadly rain. The exiles had prepared for this, taking cover in trenches and behind barriers they'd built from salvaged materials. But preparation only goes so far when you're outnumbered and outmatched. The arrows found targets. Screams rose from the settlement. Bodies fell. Then the Empire's wolves charged. They came in waves, 300 at a time, their shifts timed perfectly to maintain constant pressure. The transformation was beautiful in its horror, human forms exploding into muscle and fur and teeth, creatures built for killing moving with the unified purpose of a predator swarm. The exile fighters met them as best they could. Those with wolves shifted to match. Those without fought with weapons and tactics, and the desperate knowledge that retreat meant death. The clash was deafening, snarls and screams and the wet sounds of tearing flesh mixing with the ring of steel on steel. Leorine moved through the chaos like water through stone. She didn't fight like the others, didn't try to match strength with strength. She flowed between opponents, reading their intentions before they acted, striking at pressure points that dropped wolves twice her size, using their momentum against them. The blade from the canyon sang in her hand, not cutting, redirecting. Every swing altered the trajectory of an attack, turned an opponent's force into their own downfall. Around her, the exiles fought with the fury of people who'd already lost everything except the choice to stand. Some fell, others killed. The sand turned dark with blood from both sides, but they were losing, slowly, inevitably, mathematically. 3,000 against 1,500, training against improvisation, Empire resources against wasteland desperation. The outcome was never in doubt. By midday, the exiles had been pushed back to the center of Ashfall. Bodies littered the ground. The wounded screamed. The survivors pressed together, forming a last defensive circle around the well that had been their first miracle. Leorine stood at the front, covered in blood that was mostly not hers, breathing hard, the symbols on her skin burning bright enough to see through her torn clothes. Kavros approached on foot, his wolf form magnificent and terrible, blood dripping from claws that had ended dozens of lives today. He shifted back to human, not bothering to cover himself. Modesty was for those who feared judgment. "It's over," he said. "You fought well, better than expected. But it's over." Leorine didn't lower her blade. "Is it? Look around you. Half your fighters are dead. The rest are surrounded. You've proven whatever point you wanted to prove. Now end this before more people die for nothing." And Leorine almost agreed. Because he was right. They'd lost. The demonstration was complete. Exiles had stood against an empire and fought instead of scattering. That was something, maybe even enough. But then she saw Karth's body. The old man was slumped against the well, his chest torn open, his remaining hand still clutching a weapon he'd been too slow to use effectively. His eyes were open, staring at nothing. He'd died defending people he barely knew, for a cause that wasn't even his, because someone had finally given him something worth more than survival. Purpose. And rage crystallized in Leorine's chest. Not the hot rage of impulse. The cold rage of someone making calculations that would have horrified the girl she used to be. She looked at Kavros. "You're right. It is over, but not the way you think." She drove her blade into the ground and placed both palms flat against the sand. The symbols on her skin exploded with light, and the wasteland answered. This is what the Empire never understood about power. It comes in forms they don't recognize, from sources they've spent generations suppressing, through channels they've declared impossible. Leorine had learned in the canyon that reality was flexible, that will, applied with precision and absolute conviction, could reshape substance, that the space between thought and manifestation was thinner than breath for those who understood the relationship. She'd practiced on pebbles, on water, on small reshapings that didn't cost much. This would cost everything. But Karth was dead. And so were hundreds of others who'd believed her when she said their existence mattered, who'd trusted her to give them something worth dying for. She would not make their sacrifice meaningless. The ground beneath the Empire's army began to shift. Not violently, not like an earthquake, just a slow, inexorable transformation from solid to liquid, stone becoming sand, becoming something that couldn't support weight. Wolves who'd been standing found themselves sinking. Armor that had been protection became anchors dragging them down. The more they struggled, the faster they sank, their own strength working against them. Kavros roared orders, but there was nothing to order. No enemy to fight, no target to attack. Just the ground itself becoming hostile, responding to a will that had learned to speak its language. Leorine held the transformation, her entire being focused on maintaining the reshaping. Blood ran from her nose, her eyes, her ears. The cost of bending reality was always paid in the currency of the one doing the bending, but she held it, and the Empire's army, perfect and disciplined and overwhelming, began to panic. Wolves shifted back to human, thinking smaller forms would be easier to extract, but human hands couldn't grip sand any better than paws could. They sank faster. Some tried to help others, but that just meant more weight, more panic, more people dragging each other down into ground that had been solid moments before and would be solid again the moment Leorine stopped holding it liquid. She could save them, could release the transformation and let them climb free. Should save them because they were just soldiers following orders, wolves who'd been born into an empire and taught that strength meant dominance, and anything less was weakness. But she didn't, because power isn't about what you can do. It's about what you're willing to do. And in this moment, Leorine was willing to let 3,000 Empire wolves drown in earth to prove that the exiles they'd tried to crush were more dangerous than anyone imagined. Kavros was screaming at her. His voice was raw, desperate. "Stop this, please. They're soldiers, they're just following orders. And we're just exiles following our right to exist." Leorine's voice was distant, most of her attention focused on holding the transformation stable. "You came here to prove we were weak, defective, broken. Consider this our counter-argument. You're killing them." "No. You killed them when you decided they were expendable for your demonstration of dominance." "I'm just changing who gets demonstrated on." The general shifted into his wolf and lunged. He was fast, powerful, everything a warrior should be. Leorine sidestepped without looking, her free hand striking a pressure point that dropped him mid-leap. He hit the liquid ground and began to sink with the others. She met his eyes as he went under. "Tell Vile," she said quietly, "that his exile learned things in the dark, that his empire never dreamed existed, and that every wolf he sends to kill us will feed the wasteland until it grows strong enough to march." Kavros opened his mouth to respond. The sand filled it before sound could emerge. Then he was gone, and Leorine was alone with 3,000 Empire wolves buried in the ground that had swallowed them whole. She released the transformation. The ground solidified instantly. Where there had been an army, there was now just sand, undisturbed, peaceful, like nothing had happened. Leorine collapsed. The cost of what she'd done hit her all at once. She'd bent reality so far that pieces of her had broken under the strain. She could feel it. Something fundamental cracked in her core, damage that might not heal. But she'd proven the point. The exiles weren't weak. They were just playing a different game with different rules. And in that game, they'd just won. Hands lifted her. Voices surrounded her. The surviving exiles gathering around their leader who'd just done the impossible and saved them through methods that should not exist. Someone was crying. Someone else was laughing. Most were just silent, staring at the peaceful sand that hid horrors underneath. Leorine tried to speak, but blood came out instead of words. And in the moment before consciousness left her, she felt something shift in the wasteland, in the deep places, in the spaces between reality where the old powers slept. They'd noticed her, and they were pleased. She woke 3 days later in a shelter that smelled of herbs and sickness. The woman who'd given her the wooden carving sat beside the bed, her scarred throat working soundlessly as she tried to communicate. Finally, she just pressed a cup of water to Leorine's lips. Leorine drank. The water tasted of the well, of the miracle they'd built together. "How many?" she asked, her voice rough. The woman held up fingers. 700. 700 out of 1,500 had survived. 800 dead. More than half. But 1,500 had faced 3,000, and the survivors were still here. Still existing, still proving the Empire's definition of worth was a choice, not a law. Leorine closed her eyes, and then footsteps approached. Multiple people, moving with purpose. She opened her eyes to find Torvin standing there with a dozen others. Their expressions were complex, gratitude mixed with something that might have been fear. "What you did," Torvin said carefully, "was impossible." Leorine waited. "You killed 3,000 Empire wolves without a wolf of your own. You bent the ground itself to your will. You did things that shouldn't be possible." He paused. "And now we're wondering what else you're capable of. What other costs you're willing to pay. Because that kind of power, used that way, it changes things." "Changes what?" Leorine asked, though she already knew the answer. "Changes whether we're building an alternative to the Empire or just replacing it with a different kind of tyranny. Changes whether we're fighting for the right to exist on our terms or following someone who's decided their terms are the only ones that matter. The words hit harder than any physical blow. Because he was right. She'd killed 3,000 people to prove a point, had buried them alive in sand and felt nothing but cold satisfaction as they died, had made a calculation that their lives mattered less than the demonstration she needed to make. That was exactly what the Empire did. Defined some lives as expendable, made calculations based on whose existence mattered and whose could be sacrificed for the greater purpose. She'd become what she hated, and she'd done it so smoothly, so naturally, that she hadn't even noticed the transformation until someone pointed it out. Liarine looked at Torvin, at the others standing behind him, at faces that had trusted her and were now questioning whether that trust was misplaced. "You're right," she said quietly. "What I did was tyranny dressed as survival. I made a choice about whose lives mattered and didn't ask anyone else's opinion. That's Empire thinking." "So what now?" Torvin asked. "Now you decide. Stay and build something that doesn't require you to trust me with that kind of power, or leave and find your own path. Either way, I won't stop you. And if we stay, then we build better. With rules, with checks, with the understanding that power, any power, becomes tyranny the moment it stops being accountable." The group exchanged looks, muttered conversations Liarine couldn't quite hear. Finally, Torvin spoke. "We'll stay, but not because we trust you blindly, because we think you might actually mean what you just said. And people who recognize their own capacity for tyranny are less likely to fall into it." He turned to leave, then stopped. "But if you ever make a decision like that again without consulting us, we're gone. And we'll make sure everyone knows why." Liarine nodded. "That's fair." The group left, and Liarine was alone with the woman who couldn't speak, who just sat there watching with eyes that had seen too much and understood more than words could convey. The woman reached out and touched Liarine's hand. Not comfort, not condemnation, just contact, connection. A reminder that even when you become what you hate, someone might still see the person underneath the monster you're capable of being. Liarine held that hand and felt tears she didn't deserve track down her face. She'd won the battle, but the cost was understanding that victory, achieved through the same methods as your enemy, makes you indistinguishable from them. And the real fight, the one that mattered, wasn't against the Empire. It was against becoming so focused on survival that you forget what you're surviving for. 3 days later, a messenger arrived from the Empire. Not a soldier. A diplomat. Unarmed, carrying only a sealed message bearing the king's personal seal. Liarine met him in the center of what was left of Ashfall, surrounded by survivors who'd learned to trust her and question her in equal measure. The diplomat was young, nervous. His wolf barely contained beneath skin that looked too tight. He handed her the message without speaking, then retreated to a safe distance. Liarine broke the seal and read. The parchment was different this time. Not thick official declaration stock, just simple paper. Like Vael had written this personally, quickly, without going through official channels. The message was longer than the last one. "You killed General Kavros. You buried 3,000 of my best warriors in sand and left them there to rot. You did the impossible and proved that wolfless doesn't mean powerless. Congratulations. You have my attention. Here's what happens now. I could send another army. 10,000 this time. Enough to turn the entire wasteland to glass. But that would make you a martyr, and martyrs are dangerous to empires built on the lie that strength equals legitimacy. I could try to negotiate, offer you something you want in exchange for disbanding your settlements and accepting empire authority. But you've made it clear you don't want what I can offer. So instead, I'm going to do something you won't expect. I'm going to invite you back to the Empire. Not as an exile, not as a prisoner. As a guest. To discuss whether there's a path forward that doesn't require either of us to keep killing people who are just trying to survive. You have 7 days to accept. If you don't come, I'll assume you prefer war. And I'll give you war until the wasteland runs red and your exiles learn that survival requires more than willpower and impossible abilities. If you do come, I guarantee your safety. You'll have 3 days in the capital, under truce, to make your case for why the Empire should acknowledge what you've built instead of burning it to ash. Your choice. Signed, Vael Drakkar, who's starting to think he rejected something he should have studied instead. Liarine read it twice, then a third time. Finally, she looked at the messenger. Tell your king I accept. The young man's eyes widened. Just like that? Just like that. He left at a pace that suggested he'd expected violence and couldn't believe he was escaping with his life. The exiles surrounded Leorine, their voices rising in protest and confusion and fear. "You can't trust him," someone shouted. "It's a trap," another added. "He'll kill you the moment you enter the Empire." Leorine waited for quiet. "You're probably right," she said. "This is probably a trap. He probably wants to eliminate me in a way that looks legitimate instead of just another act of tyranny. And if I go, I'll probably die." "Then why go?" Torvin demanded. "Because if there's even a chance, a fraction of a possibility, that we can end this without more bloodshed, I have to take it." She looked around at faces that had become her responsibility. "You were right when you said I can't make these decisions alone. So I'm asking, should I go?" The vote was split. Half said yes, take the risk, try for peace. Half said no, it's suicide, don't trust the king who rejected you. In the end, it came down to a single vote. The woman who couldn't speak raised her hand. "For yes." Leorine nodded. "Then I go." She had 3 days to prepare. 3 days to train a successor in case she didn't come back. 3 days to make sure the settlements had leadership that could continue without her. 3 days to understand that she'd built something that would survive her death, which meant it was real instead of just an extension of her will. On the morning of the 7th day, she walked toward the Empire border alone. No weapons except this blade from the canyon. No guards. No backup plan. Just a woman who'd been rejected by a king, survived the wasteland, learned impossible things in the dark, and was walking back toward the throne room where her world had ended. To either change everything or die trying. Behind her, the exiles watched until she disappeared over the horizon. And in front of her, the Empire waited with teeth bared and intentions unclear. The moment of truth had arrived, and Leorine Varel, first of the returned, walked toward it, knowing that some choices change you so completely that the person who survives them is unrecognizable from the one who made them. That sometimes the only way to preserve what you're fighting for is to risk becoming what you're fighting against. And that the line between revolutionary and tyrant is so thin you can cross it without noticing until someone you trust points out the blood on your hands. She crossed into Empire territory at noon, and the gates of the capital closed behind her with a sound like a trap snapping shut. The capital looked exactly as Leorine remembered it. Black spires reaching toward a sky they seemed to own. Streets paved with stone polished smooth by centuries of wolves walking them with the certainty that this place belonged to them. Guards at every corner, their eyes tracking her with the focused attention of predators, assessing whether something is prey or threat. They'd decided on threat. Good. The escort that met her at the gate was silent and professional. 10 soldiers, all with wolves she could sense prowling just beneath their skin, all armed with weapons that could kill her a dozen different ways. They didn't speak, just formed a loose circle around her and began walking toward the palace. Leorine followed, her blade still at her hip despite the weapons she'd been told to leave behind. No one had tried to take it, maybe because it looked ceremonial, maybe because they'd heard what happened to the last army that underestimated her, or maybe because Vael had given orders to let her keep it. That thought was more unsettling than the alternative. The streets were crowded despite the early hour. Word had spread that the exiled bride was returning. People lined the walkways, pressing against buildings to watch her pass. Their expressions ranged from curiosity to contempt to something that might have been fear. No one laughed this time. That was different from the last time she'd walked these streets, dressed in white silk and humiliation, listening to nobles mock what they thought was weakness. Now they watched in silence, and silence was its own form of acknowledgement. She existed. She mattered. She was dangerous enough to warrant caution. That was progress measured in the currency of fear instead of respect, but Leorine would take it. The palace gates opened without ceremony. The guards led her through corridors she remembered, past tapestries and portraits and all the trappings of empire power. Everything looked smaller than she remembered, less grand, like distance and survival had recalibrated her sense of what actually mattered. They stopped at a door she recognized. The throne room. Of course it would be the throne room. This was theater as much as negotiation. Vial wanted her to remember where she'd been rejected, wanted the location itself to reinforce who held power here. The doors opened. The throne room was full. Not crowded like it had been during the failed coronation, but full enough. Nobles lined the walls, their wolves making the air thick with competing dominance signals. Council members sat in their designated seats, faces carved from stone and judgment. And at the center of it all, elevated on the dais that put him above everyone else, sat Vale Drakkar. He looked exactly as she remembered and completely different. Still 7 feet of controlled violence. Still marked with ancestral scars. Still radiating the kind of power that came from never questioning whether you deserved it. But his eyes were different. Harder. Like something had happened in the months since he'd exiled her. Something that had stripped away whatever illusion of invincibility he'd carried before. Leorine walked toward the dais, her footsteps echoing in the vast space. The nobles whispered. The council members watched. Vile just stared, his expression unreadable. She stopped at the exact spot where she'd stood during the rejection. The marble beneath her feet still held the memory of blood in her mouth, humiliation burning her chest, the sound of laughter that had followed her into exile. Vale stood. The room fell silent. "You came," he said. His voice was different too, less certain, like he'd expected her to refuse, to choose war over this theater. "You invited me. I expected you to see it as the trap it obviously is." Leorine smiled, and there was nothing warm in it. "It is a trap. But I'm curious what kind. The kind that kills me publicly to demonstrate empire strength. Or the kind that tries to negotiate and kills me quietly if I refuse to be reasonable." Vale's jaw tightened. What if it's neither? What if it's exactly what I said? An attempt to find a path forward that doesn't require more bloodshed? "Then you're more evolved than I gave you credit for." She looked around the room, meeting eyes that quickly looked away. "Or you've lost enough soldiers that the cost of crushing us outweighs the benefit of maintaining your definition of strength." A council member stood, an older woman, her wolf ancient and patient in her eyes. "You killed 3,000 Empire warriors, buried them alive in sand. That's an act of war, not survival." "They came to kill us," Leorine said calmly. "We defended ourselves." "The fact that our defense was more effective than you expected doesn't change the fundamental equation. You used power that shouldn't exist," another council member said. "Power without a wolf. That violates natural law." "Natural law?" Leorine turned to face the speaker directly. "Or empire law? Because last I checked, natural law doesn't care about your hierarchy. It just is. And what I did is as natural as your wolves, just operating through different channels. Channels we've spent generations suppressing," Vale said. His voice cut through the rising murmurs. "For good reason. Power without the wolf is unpredictable, uncontrollable, dangerous to the stability that keeps this empire functioning. And power with the wolf isn't?" Leorine met his eyes. "You've built an entire civilization on the premise that might makes right. That those born with wolves deserve to rule and those without deserve to serve or die. How is that more stable than what I'm offering?" "What are you offering?" Vale descended from the dais, moving toward her with the controlled grace of a predator who's decided to get closer to potential prey. Chaos disguised as liberation, the collapse of every structure that's kept millions alive and relatively safe for centuries, freedom for exiles at the cost of empire stability? He stopped an arm's length away. This close, Leorine could smell him. Wild and controlled in equal measure, the scent of a wolf who'd never had to submit to anything except his own discipline. It triggered something in her, not attraction, but recognition. Two forces designed to oppose each other, standing close enough to either destroy each other or reshape the space between them. "I'm offering proof," she said quietly, "that your structures are preferences, not necessities. That power comes in forms you've spent generations erasing, that the people you call defective are only defective by metrics you invented to justify keeping them beneath you." Vale's eyes searched her face. "You think I don't know that? You think I haven't questioned the foundations of everything I inherited? But questioning doesn't change reality. The empire functions because people believe in the hierarchy, because they trust that strength, as we define it, provides order. You threaten that belief. You threaten the entire system. Good." The word came out harder than she intended. "Your system requires exile, suppression, and the constant elimination of anything that doesn't fit. If threatening it is the cost of proving there's an alternative, I'll pay it. Even if that alternative kills thousands in the process?" Vale's voice dropped. "You buried my soldiers alive, Leorine. However justified you think that was, it was still mass execution of people who were following orders." The words hit like a physical blow because they were true. Leorine had made that calculation, had decided those lives were worth less than the demonstration she needed to make, had become exactly what she hated in the process. "You're right," she said, and the admission cost her. I made a choice that turned me into a tyrant, decided who deserved to live and who was expendable for my cause. That's empire thinking. That's exactly what I'm supposed to be fighting against. So why did you do it? Because I was drowning in rage and grief and the need to prove we weren't weak. Because I'd watched hundreds of exiles die and needed their deaths to mean something. Because I was terrified that if I didn't demonstrate overwhelming force, you'd send another army and another until we were all dead. She met his eyes. I did it because I'm not as evolved as I pretend to be. Because violence, even in defense, requires you to become comfortable with calculations that would horrify the person you were before survival demanded them. Because the line between fighting tyranny and becoming a different version of it is so thin you cross it without noticing. The throne room was silent. Nobles who'd expected defiance or justification shifted uncomfortably. Council members who'd prepared counterarguments found themselves with nothing to argue against. Vale stared at her like he was seeing her for the first time. "You know what the worst part is?" he said finally. "I rejected you because I thought you were weak, defective, unworthy of standing beside a king. And now you're standing here telling me you've become exactly the kind of ruthless that would have made you a perfect queen." The irony is almost funny. "Almost," Leorine agreed, "except for the thousands of dead people it took to get here." Vale turned, walking toward the throne but not sitting, just standing beside it, one hand resting on the armrest like he needed the physical reminder of what he ruled. "Here's the situation," he said, addressing the room as much as Leorine. "We can't coexist. The Empire's legitimacy requires that strength, as we define it, matters. Your existence proves it doesn't. That creates an impossible equation." He looked back at her. "So we have three options. First, I can send armies until you're crushed, and every exile learns what happens when you challenge Empire authority. That works tactically, but creates martyrs, and martyrs are more dangerous than living rebels. Second, I can negotiate. Give you some territory in the wasteland, official recognition, maybe even a seat on the council. That acknowledges your power but undermines the entire hierarchy. If wolfless exiles can demand seats at the table, why can't everyone else who doesn't fit our definitions?" "What's the third option?" Leorine asked. "You and I fight. Here. Now. Single combat. Winner determines the future of both Empire and exiles. No armies, no politics, just the two of us testing whether your impossible power can match my wolf in a direct confrontation." The room erupted. Nobles shouted objections. Council members stood in protest. This wasn't how empires worked. This wasn't how conflicts were resolved. But Vale raised his hand and silence fell. "You came here expecting to die," he said to Leorine, "expecting this to be a trap designed to eliminate you in a way that looked legitimate. So I'm offering you exactly that. A fight you'll probably lose, but one where you at least get to face your enemy directly instead of dying to politics or poison. And if I win?" Leorine's voice was steady. "If you win, the Empire acknowledges that power without a wolf is legitimate, that our hierarchy is preference, not natural law, that exiles deserve more than death or submission." She saw calculation in his eyes. "And I step down. Let someone less invested in the old structures rebuild from whatever pieces remain. If you win?" "If I win, the exiles disband. They scatter or integrate into the Empire under our terms. The settlements are destroyed, and the idea that you can challenge centuries of structure with impossible abilities dies with you." Leorine looked around the throne room, at nobles who wanted her dead, at council members calculating advantages, at guards ready to intervene if she made the wrong move. This was suicide. Single combat against a king bred for dominance, trained since birth, carrying a wolf that made him stronger and faster and more durable than anything human should be. Against her, with her blade and her impossible abilities and a body still recovering from bending reality hard enough to bury an army. The odds weren't just bad, they were astronomical. But they'd always been astronomical. From the moment she'd walked into the wasteland with no wolf and no chance of survival. From the moment she'd decided to build something instead of dying quietly. Astronomical odds were familiar territory. "I accept," she said. Vale nodded slowly, like he'd expected this but hoped otherwise. "Tomorrow, at dawn. The combat arena. No rules except one of us leaves alive and the other doesn't." He moved closer, his voice dropping so only she could hear. "I'm going to kill you, Leorine, not because I want to, not even because you threaten the Empire, but because letting you live means admitting I was wrong about you, that I rejected something valuable because I couldn't recognize value outside my definitions, And that admission would unravel everything I've built my identity around. Lyrine met his eyes and saw something unexpected in them. Regret, not for what he was about to do, but for what he'd done months ago. For the rejection that had started this cascade. For the moment when he'd looked at a woman without a wolf and decided she was worthless instead of asking why his metrics couldn't account for her. "I know," she said quietly, "and I'm going to survive you. Not because I want to, not because I hate you, but because dying here means all those exiles who believed me were wrong too. That their existence doesn't matter. That the Empire's definition of worth is the only one that counts." She stepped back. "See you at dawn," she said. "Try to get some sleep. You'll need it." The guards escorted her to chambers that were probably meant to be luxurious, but felt like a cell. Soft bed, clean water, food that didn't taste like desperation, and wasteland dust. She didn't sleep. How could she? In less than 12 hours, she'd be fighting for her life against someone designed to kill people like her. Someone who had every advantage except the one thing she'd cultivated in the dark beneath the wasteland. The understanding that power doesn't come from what you are. It comes from what you're willing to become. Hours passed in meditation and preparation. Lyrine went through every technique she'd learned in the canyon, every impossible thing she'd made possible through will and precision. She traced the symbols on her skin, feeling them pulse with energy that shouldn't exist. And she thought about Karth, about the woman who couldn't speak, about Torvin and all the others who'd trusted her to give them something worth more than survival. She couldn't fail them, even if failure was the most likely outcome. Especially then. This is what leadership means. Not having all the answers, not being invincible, just refusing to quit even when quitting is the rational choice. Carrying the weight of other people's belief even when you're not sure you deserve it. Being willing to die so that the idea you represent survives. Lyrine had never wanted to be a leader, had never asked for the responsibility of representing everyone the Empire discarded. But want didn't matter. Need didn't matter. Only the fight mattered. And the fight was coming with the dawn. Someone knocked on her door an hour before sunrise. Lyrine answered, expecting guards. Instead, she found a woman she recognized, one of Vale's advisors, ancient and sharp-eyed, her wolf barely contained beneath skin that looked like parchment. The old woman stepped inside without invitation, closing the door behind her. "You're going to lose," she said without preamble. "Probably," Lyrine agreed. "Definitely." The advisor moved to the window, looking out at the capital beginning to wake. "Vile is everything you're not, bred for combat, trained by the best warriors in the Empire. His wolf is pure bloodline, 3 centuries of selective breeding to create the perfect killing machine. Then why are you here? To gloat?" The old woman turned, and her eyes were complicated. "To give you a choice you don't know you have." She produced a vial from her robes, small, glass, filled with liquid that looked like oil and shadow mixed together. "Drink this before the fight. It'll level the playing field. Give you the strength and speed to match his wolf. Won't make you invincible, but it'll make you competitive." Lyrine took the vial, holding it up to the light. "What is it?" The old woman smiled, and it was the saddest expression Lyrine had ever seen. "Suppressed bloodline essence. Extracted from women like you over centuries. The power the Empire spent generations trying to erase, condensed into something you can metabolize." She moved toward the door. "Drink it, and you might survive. Refuse it, and you'll die, proving a point that won't matter because you'll be too dead to see it change anything." "Wait," Lyrine said. "Why are you helping me?" The advisor paused at the door. "Because I had a daughter once. Wolfless, beautiful, brilliant. And I watched the Empire exile her because she didn't fit their definitions of worth. She died in the wasteland 30 years ago." Her voice cracked. "And I've spent every day since wondering what she could have become if someone had given her a chance. If someone had helped her instead of just watching her walk into death." The door closed, and Lyrine was alone with a choice that would define everything. She could drink the vial, level the playing field, give herself a real chance at survival and victory. Use the suppressed power of everyone like her who'd been erased by the Empire to prove that they mattered, or she could refuse, fight with only what she'd learned and earned. Prove that even without enhancement, even without shortcuts, the power she'd cultivated was enough. The first option was pragmatic, smart, the kind of decision someone who actually wanted to win would make. The second was pride disguised as principle. Lyrine held the vial for a long time, watching the liquid swirl inside the glass like it was alive, like it was waiting for her decision. Finally, she set it on the table, unopened. Because if she won using power extracted from the Empire's victims, she'd be using their suffering as a tool. Would be no different from the Empire itself, which had built everything on the suppressed potential of people it deemed less than. If she was going to win, it had to be on her own terms, with her own power. Or not at all. Dawn came with the sound of drums. The combat arena was ancient, carved into bedrock centuries ago, designed for challenges that determined succession and settled disputes too important for politics. The floor was sand, dark as dried blood. The walls were stone, smooth and high, preventing escape or interference. And the seats were full. Thousands of wolves packed the arena, their combined presence making the air thick and hostile. They'd come to watch their king prove Empire supremacy, to see the exile who'd killed 3,000 warriors get crushed as punishment and demonstration. They wanted a show. Leorine intended to give them one. She entered from the west gate, dressed in simple combat leathers, the blade from the canyon at her hip. No armor, no enhancement, just her and the skills she'd earned in darkness and survival. The crowd roared, not cheers, something between anticipation and bloodlust. Vale entered from the east. He'd shifted partially, enough to show his wolf without losing human form. His skin rippled with muscle that didn't exist in baseline humanity. His eyes burned gold. His teeth had elongated into something designed for tearing. This was what perfection looked like in the Empire's metrics. Power and control balanced perfectly. Human intelligence directing animal ferocity. He was magnificent, and he was going to try to kill her. They met in the center of the arena. No ceremony, no speeches. Just two forces designed to oppose each other, standing close enough to see the determination in each other's eyes. "Ready?" Vale asked. "No," Leorine said honestly, "but that's never stopped me before." Vale's expression shifted. Almost a smile. Almost respect. Then he attacked. The speed was inhuman. One moment he was standing, the next he was a blur of motion, claws extended, aiming for her throat with precision that came from a lifetime of training. Leorine moved, not away, through. She flowed past his attack, her blade singing as it deflected claws that could have torn her apart. The symbols on her skin burned bright, every one of them a reminder of impossible things she'd learned to make possible. Vile spun, recovering instantly, attacking again from a different angle. Faster this time, more committed. Leorine met him with precision instead of strength, redirected his momentum, used his speed against him, made him fight not just her but the space between intention and action, thought and execution. The crowd noise intensified. This wasn't supposed to happen. The exile was supposed to die quickly, proving that wolf power was superior. Instead, she was matching him. Not in strength, she couldn't match that, but in strategy, in understanding, in the kind of fighting that turned every advantage into a liability if used predictably. Vile snarled and pressed harder. His attacks came faster, more brutal, testing her defenses from every angle. Claws raked air where she'd been a fraction of a second before. Teeth snapped shut on nothing as she twisted away. But the margin was getting thinner. Sooner or later, she'd be a fraction too slow. Would misjudge an angle. Would make the single mistake that's all it takes when fighting someone this dangerous. She had to change the equation. Leorine stopped retreating and attacked. Her blade flashed toward Vale's exposed ribs. He blocked, but the move forced him defensive. She pressed, not with strength, but with relentless precision, targeting pressure points and weak spots with strikes, designed not to overpower but to accumulate damage. One cut on his arm, shallow, barely bleeding. Another on his thigh, deeper, making him favor that leg. A third across his ribs. Not fatal, but painful. Death by 1,000 cuts wasn't dramatic, but it worked. Vale roared and shifted fully. The transformation was instant. Human form exploding into wolf, 7 feet becoming 8, muscle doubling, control giving way to pure animal fury. This was what the crowd wanted. The king in his true form, ready to tear apart the exile who dared challenge him. Leorine stood her ground. The wolf charged. There was no strategy this time, no precision, just overwhelming force designed to crush anything in its path. Leorine pressed her free hand to the arena sand and pulled. The ground responded, not liquefying like she'd done in the wasteland. That would kill Vale instantly and prove nothing except that she could murder when cornered. Instead, the sand formed a wall, solid, instantaneous, rising between her and the charging wolf fast enough to... Vale hit it at full speed, The impact was catastrophic. The wall shattered. Vale tumbled, his momentum destroyed, his charge turned into a disoriented sprawl. Leorine was on him before he could recover. Her blade found the soft spot beneath his ribs. Not deep, not fatal, just enough to prove she could have killed him if she'd chosen to. She stepped back. Vale shifted to human, blood running from the shallow cut, his breathing ragged. The crowd had gone silent. This wasn't how it was supposed to end. The exile was supposed to die. The king was supposed to prove empire supremacy. Instead, she'd spared him. Yield, Leorine said quietly. Vale's eyes burned. Never. Then we keep going until one of us can't, she raised her blade. And eventually, that'll be you. Because I've already died once, in a wasteland where I had nothing except the will to survive. You've never experienced that. Never felt what it's like to have everything stripped away except the choice to quit or evolve. You don't know what I've experienced. You're right. I don't. But I know what you haven't. And that's the difference between us. Vale stood, his wolf surging beneath his skin, fury and something else warring in his expression. That something else was realization. That Leorine was right. That he'd been born into power, raised in certainty, never truly tested by the kind of existential threat that forces evolution, while she'd been forged in it. The king attacked again, but his heart wasn't in it anymore. Leorine could feel it in the tempo of his strikes, the hesitation creeping into moves that should have been decisive. He was starting to believe he might lose, and belief shapes reality more than strength ever could. They fought for what felt like hours but was probably minutes. Vael's attacks slowing, his defenses weakening, blood from a dozen shallow cuts dripping onto sand that had seen centuries of combat and never seen a king brought this close to defeat. Leorine was bleeding too, slashes across her arms, a deep gash on her shoulder, her ribs screaming from an impact she hadn't quite dodged. But she was still standing, still fighting, still proving that wolfless didn't mean powerless. Finally, Vael collapsed to one knee. His wolf flickered, the partial shift destabilizing. His breathing was labored. His eyes held something Leorine had never seen in them before. Defeat. Not physical defeat. Not yet. But the deeper kind. The acceptance that he was facing something he couldn't overcome through conventional means. Do it, he said hoarsely. End it. Leorine stood over him, blade raised, positioned perfectly to deliver the killing strike. The arena held its breath. This was the moment. Victory or death? Proof that her power was legitimate or confirmation that she'd just gotten lucky? She lowered her blade. No, she said. The crowd exploded into confused noise, shouts, questions, demands for explanation. Leorine ignored them, focusing entirely on Vael. I didn't come here to kill you, she said. I came here to prove that your metrics are wrong, that power exists outside your definitions, that the people you call defective are only defective by standards you invented. She extended her hand. You lost this fight, but not because you're weak, because you're fighting to maintain a system that requires you to never question whether it's right. And that requirement is what makes you vulnerable. Get up, acknowledge what you saw here, and help me build something better than what either of us inherited. Vael stared at her hand like it was a weapon more dangerous than her blade, because, in a way, it was. Accepting it meant accepting that everything he'd built his identity on was negotiable, that the Empire's foundations could be questioned, that the girl he'd rejected might have been right about more than just her own worth. His hand started to rise, and then an arrow punched through Leorine's shoulder from behind, the impact spinning her around, blood spraying across sand and king. The arena erupted into chaos. Leorine hit the ground, her vision blurring, trying to locate the archer who'd just violated every rule of single combat, and saw the old advisor standing in the royal box, bow in hand, her ancient face twisted with something between rage and grief. Forgive me, the woman mouthed, but my daughter died for nothing, and I won't let the Empire change for someone else's child when it wouldn't change for mine. Guards were moving, nobles shouting, Vael screaming orders. But Leorine's world was narrowing to the pain in her shoulder and the understanding that she'd been betrayed not by an enemy, but by someone who'd lost so much to the Empire that she couldn't bear to see it evolve. She tried to stand and collapsed instead, the arrow having done more damage than she'd realized. Vael was beside her suddenly, his hands pressing against the wound, his voice raw with something that might have been panic. Stay with me, he commanded. Don't you dare die now. Leorine laughed, tasting blood. Kind of ironic. You were about to kill me anyway. I was going to fight you, not execute you from behind like a coward. His eyes blazed. You're not dying to assassination, not after everything. Might not be my choice. Her vision was fading. Blood loss or poison on the arrow, she couldn't tell which. The last thing she saw before darkness took her was Vael's face, twisted with an expression she'd never expected to see there. Fear of losing something he'd just realized mattered. And the last thing she heard was his voice, rough and desperate, speaking words that would reshape an empire if she survived to hear them properly. The fight isn't over, and neither are you. Then nothing. Just darkness and the distant sound of a world collapsing into consequences that no one had predicted. Pain woke her, not the sharp kind that signals injury, the deep kind that suggests your body has been fighting for survival while your consciousness was elsewhere, and the fight costs more than you can immediately calculate. Leorine opened her eyes to find herself in a room she didn't recognize. White stone walls, windows letting in light that hurt to look at. And beside her bed, slumped in a chair that looked too small for his frame, was Vael. He was asleep, or unconscious. It was hard to tell. His face was drawn, shadows under his eyes that suggested he hadn't rested properly in days. His hands were stained with blood that had dried to rust. Her blood. She tried to sit up and immediately regretted it. The arrow wound in her shoulder screamed protest, sending waves of agony through her chest that made her gasp. The sound woke Vael instantly. His eyes snapped open, gold flaring bright, his wolf surging to alertness before his human mind caught up. Then recognition hit, and something in his expression shifted from threat assessment to something more complicated. Relief, maybe. Or the guilty knowledge that she'd almost died because of a system he'd spent his life defending. "You're awake," he said. His voice was rough, like he'd been screaming or hadn't used it in a while. "How long?" Leorine asked. 3 days. You've been in and out, mostly out. The arrow was poisoned, some old compound designed to kill slowly enough that the victim suffers. We had to cycle through every antidote the palace physicians knew before finding one that worked. He stood, moving to pour water from a pitcher beside the bed. His movements were careful, controlled, like he was afraid sudden motion might break something fragile. "Here, drink." Leorine took the cup with her good hand, the water tasting like it came from wells that had never known wasteland desperation. Clean, pure. The kind of luxury that used to be her birthright before exile turned her into something that couldn't appreciate luxury without remembering everyone who'd never have it. "The advisor," she said after draining the cup. "The one who shot me. Dead." Vael's voice went flat. She took poison immediately after releasing the arrow. Left a confession explaining she couldn't let the Empire change when it hadn't changed for her daughter. That watching you succeed where her child failed was worse than watching you die. He sat back down, suddenly looking older than his years. The crowd wanted to burn her body, deny her the proper rights. I refused. She was a mother who lost everything to a system I enforce. That doesn't excuse attempted murder, but it explains it. An explanation matters when you're trying to understand how your empire creates people desperate enough to poison arrows during sacred combat. "Sacred combat I was winning," Leorine pointed out. "Leorine, you were." Vael met her eyes, and everyone saw it. "Thousands of wolves watched you bring me to my knees without having one of your own. Watched you spare me when you could have killed me. Watched you prove that every metric we've built our hierarchy on is negotiable." He leaned forward. "Do you understand what that means? What you've done?" "I survived, same as always." "No. You didn't just survive, you shattered a foundational myth. The Empire has operated on the premise that wolf power equals legitimate authority for so long that questioning it was unthinkable. You made it thinkable. Made 3,000 witnesses watch their king lose to someone they'd been taught was defective." Vael's jaw tightened. "I can't put that back in the box. Can't pretend it didn't happen. So now I have to decide whether to double down on the old structures and prove you were an anomaly worth crushing, or acknowledge you were right and help build whatever comes next." "And which are you choosing?" Leorine asked. "I don't know yet." His honesty was startling. "The smart move is crushing you, executing you publicly for the crime of killing 3,000 Empire soldiers. Using your death to reinforce that challenging the hierarchy has consequences. That would stabilize things, maintain order, prevent the chaos your existence threatens. But I've spent 3 days watching you fight poison that should have killed you in hours. Watching you survive through pure stubborn will, even while unconscious. And I keep thinking about what you said in the arena, that I've never been truly tested, never experienced the kind of existential threat that forces evolution. He stood, walking to the window, his back to her. You were right. I was born into power, raised to believe my wolf made me superior, taught that strength as we define it was the only thing that mattered, and I never questioned it because questioning would mean admitting the entire structure I benefit from is arbitrary. Vael turned to face her. But watching you almost die for the crime of proving our metrics are wrong made me realize something. The empire I've spent my life serving doesn't just exile the powerless. It exiles anyone who threatens the comfortable fiction that power distribution is natural instead of enforced. And that makes me complicit in a system I'm starting to think is broken at its foundation. The admission hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that would reshape everything if spoken outside this room. Leorine studied him. Really looked at the man who'd rejected her, exiled her, sent armies to crush her, and saw something she hadn't expected. Genuine uncertainty. Not the performance of doubt designed to seem thoughtful before making the same decision you always would have. Real uncertainty. The kind that comes from having your worldview challenged so thoroughly that going back to comfortable certainty isn't an option. What do you want from me? She asked. I want you to tell me how to fix this. Vael's voice was raw. How do I reconcile being king of an empire built on hierarchies I'm starting to think are unjust with the responsibility of not throwing millions of people into chaos by dismantling those hierarchies overnight? How do I acknowledge you were right without creating a power vacuum that gets more people killed than the current system does? How do I evolve without destroying everything in the process? Leorine was quiet for a long moment, feeling the weight of what he was asking. This wasn't a rhetorical question. He genuinely wanted an answer, wanted her to solve a problem that had no clean solution. And the truth was, she didn't have one. You don't, she said finally. You can't reconcile those things because they're fundamentally opposed. Either you maintain the hierarchies and keep the empire stable at the cost of everyone those hierarchies crush, or you dismantle them and accept that the transition will be brutal and chaotic and will probably kill people. There's no clean path. No way to be righteous and practical simultaneously. So what do? You choose which future you want to build toward, and accept that getting there will require becoming someone you're not sure you want to be. Same choice I made in the wasteland when I buried your soldiers. Same choice everyone makes when survival requires evolution. She shifted in the bed, ignoring the pain. You asked me once what I was offering. Here's the real answer. I'm offering proof that your system isn't inevitable. That power comes in forms you've suppressed, that the people you discard aren't weak, just incompatible with metrics designed to keep them beneath you. But I'm not offering a blueprint for what comes next. That's not my responsibility. I built an alternative in the wasteland because I had to. You have to build your own alternative here, in the Empire, using the resources and authority you have. And if you can't, Vael asked, then you step aside and let someone who can take over. That's what leaders do when they realize they're not capable of the evolution their people need. They don't cling to power out of pride. They recognize that sometimes the best thing you can do is get out of the way. Vael laughed, the sound bitter. You make it sound simple. It's not simple. It's agonizing. Leorine met his eyes. But it's also necessary, because the alternative is spending the rest of your life enforcing a system you know is broken, becoming more tyrannical every day to maintain structures that require increasing brutality to sustain, and that path ends with you becoming exactly what you're afraid I'll become if I gain too much power. A ruler so invested in their own authority that they'll sacrifice anything to maintain it. The silence that followed was heavy with truths neither of them wanted to fully acknowledge. Finally, Vael spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. What if I asked you to stay? To help me rebuild this empire into something that doesn't require exile and suppression to function. Leorine felt something complicated twist in her chest. Not attraction, though that was there too, unwanted and inconvenient. Something deeper. The recognition that the man who'd rejected her had evolved into someone capable of asking that question genuinely. I can't, she said. The exiles who followed me into this aren't my subjects. They're people who chose to build something outside your empire. I can't abandon them to play politics in the place that tried to kill us. And more than that, I don't belong here. Never did. This world requires compromises I'm not capable of making, diplomacy I'm too broken to perform, patience I burn through in the wasteland. You belong where you choose to belong, Bael said. No. You belong where you're capable of functioning, and I'm capable of building in the margins, in the wasteland, in the places your empire doesn't care about, not in throne rooms and council chambers where every word has 17 meanings and honesty is a liability. So that's it? Vale's voice held something that might have been disappointment. We go back to being enemies? We were never enemies. We're just operating on different frequencies. You're trying to reform an empire from within. I'm trying to build an alternative from without. Those goals don't have to conflict. How do they not conflict? Your existence undermines my legitimacy. My empire's survival requires delegitimizing you. Only if you insist on a zero-sum equation. Leorine shifted again, forcing herself to sit up despite the pain. What if instead of viewing the wasteland settlements as threats, you view them as pressure valves? Places where people who don't fit your hierarchies can go instead of dying or being crushed. What if you officially recognize that your metrics aren't universal? That wolf power is one form of legitimate strength, but not the only one. That there are multiple ways to organize society, and the empire's way doesn't have to be the only permitted version? That would fracture empire unity, Vale said. Different power structures can't coexist without conflict. They've been coexisting for months. Your empire operates one way. My settlements operate another. The only conflict comes from your insistence that there's only one legitimate approach. And if I officially recognize your approach, every disaffected group in the empire will demand the same recognition. Every minority that feels oppressed will want their own settlements, their own structures, their own alternatives. Good. Let them build. Let 1,000 different approaches emerge and let people choose which ones work for them. That's not fracturing, that's evolution. Vale stared at her like she'd suggested dismantling the sun. You're talking about the end of the empire as it exists. I'm talking about the transformation of the empire into something more flexible, something that doesn't require conformity to survive, something that can accommodate difference instead of crushing it. She met his eyes. You asked how to fix this. That's how. Stop trying to maintain a monolithic structure and start allowing diversity. Stop enforcing one definition of strength and start acknowledging that strength comes in forms you haven't imagined. Stop treating exile as elimination and start treating it as migration to a different social model. And accept that the empire that emerges from that transformation won't be the one you inherited. It'll be something new, possibly better, possibly worse, but definitely different. The weight of what she was proposing settled over the room like snow, quiet, inexorable, changing the landscape whether you wanted it to or not. Vale walked back to his chair and sat, his expression distant, calculating, running scenarios that probably involved civil war and collapse and every nightmare that keeps rulers awake at night. Finally, he spoke. If I do this, if I recognize the wasteland settlements as legitimate alternative societies, I'll need guarantees. No raids on Empire territories, no recruitment of Empire citizens. Clear boundaries between your jurisdiction and mine. Agreed. On one condition. Which is free movement. Anyone who wants to leave the Empire for the settlements can. Anyone who wants to leave the settlements for the Empire can. No forced retention on either side. People choose their own society. Vale's jaw tightened. That's a massive concession. It means I can't prevent defection. It means you have to make the Empire worth staying in. That's not a concession. That's accountability. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded, sharp and final. Done. I'll draft the recognition documents. You'll have official status as autonomous territories under your own governance. And we'll establish a council to manage disputes between our jurisdictions. Leorine felt something unclench in her chest. Not victory. This wasn't victory. This was compromise, messy and imperfect and probably temporary, but it was also survival for her people, for the exiles who trusted her, for the idea that you didn't have to fit empire metrics to deserve existence. There's one more thing, Vale said. Of course there is. His expression shifted to something more vulnerable, the rejection. What I did to you in this throne room, I need you to know that I— Don't, Leorine interrupted. Don't apologize. Don't explain. Don't try to make it better with words. But I need to— No. You need to live with it. She kept her voice gentle despite the hardness of the words. You made a calculation based on the metrics you were raised with. You looked at someone without a wolf and decided they were worthless. That choice set everything else in motion. And you don't get to absolve yourself of it just because you've evolved since then. You carry it. Let it remind you every day that your metrics were wrong, that you're capable of enormous cruelty when you're certain you're right. That certainty itself is dangerous. Vael's face was stone, but his eyes were complicated. That's harsh. That's honest. And you asked me to help you fix this. Well, this is how. You don't fix systemic cruelty by feeling bad about it. You fix it by remembering exactly how it felt to inflict it and letting that memory prevent you from inflicting it again. You don't forgive me. I don't know yet. Leorine's voice was quiet. Ask me in 10 years, after I've seen whether you actually implement the changes you're promising or whether this is just performance until the crisis passes and you go back to comfortable tyranny. Ask me. After you've proven that acknowledging you were wrong about me means you're also willing to be wrong about everyone else you've dismissed. Fair enough. They sat in silence, two people who'd started as bride and groom and become something far more complicated. Not enemies, not allies. Something that didn't have a clean name because it existed in the space between opposition and collaboration. Eventually, a knock came at the door. Vael stood. That'll be the physicians. They'll want to check your wound, make sure the poison is fully purged. He moved toward the door, then stopped. When you're well enough to travel, I'll provide escort back to the wasteland. Full honors. So everyone sees that you're returning as a recognized leader, not a defeated exile. Leorine nodded. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. This could still collapse. The nobles will resist. The council will push back. Half the empire will think I've lost my mind. And there's a non-zero chance this ends with civil war and both of us dead. Then we'll die having tried something different. Better than dying to maintain something broken. Vael almost smiled. You really don't compromise, do you? Not on things that matter. He opened the door, admitting physicians who descended on Leorine with the focused efficiency of people who'd spent days keeping her alive and weren't about to let their work be wasted now. Vael left, and Leorine submitted to being examined, prodded, and pronounced miraculously fortunate to be alive. The poison should have killed her. The blood loss should have killed her. The sheer trauma of everything she'd endured should have killed her. But she'd survived. Same as always. 5 days later, Leorine stood at the eastern gate where she'd been exiled months earlier. The same gate. The same wasteland stretching beyond it. But everything else was different. Behind her stood Vael and a delegation of Empire officials, their expressions ranging from barely concealed contempt to genuine curiosity. In front of her stood Torvin and a group from the settlements, their faces showing relief and wariness in equal measure. And between them stood the marker Vael had commissioned, a pillar of black stone inscribed with the recognition agreement, proof that what they'd negotiated wasn't just words, but something being carved into the permanent record. The official language was bureaucratic and careful, but the core was simple. The wasteland settlements were recognized as autonomous territories. Empire citizens could migrate there freely. Exile was no longer a death sentence, but a choice of different jurisdiction. It was imperfect. It left 1,000 questions unanswered. It would probably create as many problems as it solved, but it was something. Vael stepped forward, his voice carrying across the crowd. Today marks a change in how this empire understands power and legitimacy. We have operated for centuries on the belief that strength, as we define it, is the only valid foundation for authority. That belief led us to exile, suppress, and eliminate anyone who didn't conform to our metrics. He looked at Leorine, and it led us to discard someone who proved our metrics were incomplete, who demonstrated that power comes in forms we'd spent generations trying to erase, who built something functional and legitimate using foundations we'd declared impossible. The Empire was wrong. I was wrong. And rather than compound that error by continuing to insist our way is the only way, we're choosing evolution. Murmurs ran through both crowds. Not all positive. Change never is, especially to those comfortable with current arrangements. But enough people looked thoughtful. Enough seemed willing to consider that maybe rigid hierarchies weren't the only path to order. Vael extended his hand to Leorine. Go in peace. Build in peace. And know that you have proven what needed proving, that existence itself, maintained against everything designed to eliminate it, is a form of power that empires ignore at their peril. Leorine took his hand. The contact was brief, formal, but something passed between them. Not forgiveness, that would take years, if it happened at all, but acknowledgement. Understanding that they'd both been shaped by a system that required them to be enemies, and they'd managed to become something else instead. She released his hand and turned to address the crowd. To everyone who was exiled, suppressed, or told they were defective because they didn't fit Empire metrics, you were never broken. You were just measured by standards designed to keep you beneath those already powerful. And you survived anyway, built anyway, proved anyway. Her voice strengthened. The settlements aren't perfect. We're still figuring out how to organize without hierarchies, how to accommodate difference without descending into chaos. We'll make mistakes. Some of them will be terrible, but they'll be our mistakes. Made by us, for us, in service of our vision of what society could be instead of what the Empire insists it must be. She looked at Vielle one final time. Thank you for recognizing what you tried to erase. Now comes the harder part, actually implementing the change you've promised. Don't make me come back here to remind you. The king almost smiled. I wouldn't dream of it. Leorine walked through the gate. Torvin fell into step beside her, his expression complicated. Did we just witness history or the setup for a disaster? Probably both, Leorine said. History's cleanest moments usually contain the seeds of future disasters. You're not exactly radiating optimism. I'm radiating realism. She looked at the wasteland ahead, the settlements that had become home in ways the palace never was. We bought time, recognition, the legal framework to exist without being hunted. But we didn't solve the fundamental tension between different power structures sharing space. So what now? Now we build better. Make the settlements functional enough that they're not just alternatives, but improvements. Demonstrate that you don't need rigid hierarchies to create order. That diversity doesn't equal chaos if you have the right structures to accommodate it. And if we can't? Then Vale was right to be cautious, and this ends in conflict. But at least we'll have tried. They walked in silence for a while, the wasteland wind carrying the scent of salt and possibility, and the complicated future they'd just agreed to navigate. Behind them, the Empire delegation dispersed, some returning to the capital to begin the brutal work of implementation, others plotting resistance to changes they viewed as Empire suicide. Ahead, the settlements waited, growing, evolving, becoming something that couldn't be easily categorized or dismissed. Karth would have loved this, Leorine said quietly. The old man spent his whole life in exile, and he died right before exile stopped being a death sentence. Torvin nodded. He died making it possible, though. Him and hundreds of others. They bought us the chance to be more than refugees waiting to die. That's all any of us can do. Buy chances for people who come after us. Hope they use them better than we did. The settlement appeared on the horizon as the sun began to set. Structures that had been improvised lean-tos were now solid buildings. The well that had been their first miracle was now the center of an irrigation system feeding gardens that shouldn't exist in wasteland soil. People who'd been dying when Leorine found them were now thriving. Not perfectly, not without struggle, but thriving nonetheless. The woman who couldn't speak was waiting at the settlement entrance. When she saw Leorine, her scarred face broke into a smile that needed no words to convey its meaning. Welcome home. Leorine embraced her, feeling the weight of everything she'd survived, everything she'd become, everything she still had to do settling onto shoulders that had learned to carry impossible loads. Home. The word tasted strange. She'd been exiled from her first home, had built a second one in desperation, and was now returning to it as something neither exile nor empire, but something new. Something undefined by either category. That night, the settlement gathered around the central fire. No ceremony, no speeches, just people who'd survived together sitting in proximity, sharing food and silence and the complicated relief of knowing they'd made it through another crisis. Leorine sat slightly apart, watching faces illuminated by firelight, seeing the scars they all carried, physical and otherwise. Understanding that what they'd built wasn't utopia, it was just a different set of problems, hopefully more honest than the ones they'd escaped. Torvin approached, settling beside her with the comfortable silence of people who'd fought together enough times to not need constant conversation. You know this won't last, he said eventually. The recognition, the peace. Empires don't fundamentally change. They just adapt enough to survive threats and then revert to type. Probably, Leorine agreed. But we bought time. And in that time we can build deep enough that reverting becomes harder than continuing to evolve. You sound like you're planning to be here a while. Where else would I go? She looked at him. This is what I fought for, not recognition from the Empire. The chance for exiles to exist on their own terms. I don't get to walk away from that just because it's harder than I expected. Torvin nodded slowly. Good. Because some of us were worried you'd go back to the Empire. Take Vale up on whatever offer he probably made. He made one. I refused. Why? Because belonging somewhere means being capable of functioning there. And I'm capable of functioning here, in the margins, building with people who understand what it means to survive outside the structures that were supposed to protect them. I'm not capable of palace politics and the endless calculations of who to appease and who to sacrifice. She smiled, tired but genuine. I'm too broken for empire work, but I'm exactly broken enough for this. The fire crackled. Someone started singing, a wasteland song that had emerged from exile rather than being brought from the empire. Others joined in, voices rough but committed. Leorine listened, feeling something settle in her chest that might have been peace, not the peace of resolved conflict, the peace of knowing she was exactly where she needed to be, doing exactly what she was capable of doing, with people who understood that survival wasn't the end goal, building something better than survival was. The stars came out, more visible here than they'd ever been in the Empire where light pollution dimmed the sky. Leorine looked up at them and remembered the first night in the wasteland, freezing and certain she was dying. She'd survived that night, and every night since. Not through strength as the Empire defined it, through stubbornness and evolution and the understanding that the only unforgivable surrender is giving up on yourself. You good? Torvin asked. No, Leorine said honestly. I'm wounded, traumatized, carrying the weight of hundreds of deaths I'm responsible for, and facing a future that's probably going to be harder than anything that came before. She looked at him. But I'm here. We're here. We built something that exists despite everything designed to prevent it. And tomorrow, we'll wake up and build more. That's not optimism. No, it's just reality refusing to be what other people insist it must be. Torvin laughed, the sound rough but real. You really don't compromise, not on things that matter. They sat in comfortable silence as the settlement settled into night. Guards taking positions, families retreating to shelters that were becoming homes, children sleeping without the constant fear that had defined their early lives. This was what victory looked like. Not triumph, not domination, not the satisfying conclusion where evil was vanquished and good prevailed cleanly. Just people continuing to exist despite everything that said they shouldn't. Building despite everything that said they couldn't. Evolving despite everything that said change was impossible. Leorine Verrel, the wolfless bride who'd been rejected by a king and exiled to die, sat in a wasteland that had become home and felt something she hadn't felt in months. Not happiness, not satisfaction, just the quiet recognition that she'd done what she set out to do. She'd survived, she'd built, she'd proven that the Empire's metrics were negotiable, and in doing so, she'd become exactly what she'd always been but had never been allowed to be. Not defective, not broken, not weak, just powerful in ways that required the world to expand its definitions instead of insisting she fit into the ones already established. The fire burned low. People drifted to sleep, and Leorine remained, watching the embers glow against the dark, thinking about Vale, implementing changes that would probably cost him everything. Thinking about Karth, who died believing change was possible. Thinking about the woman who couldn't speak, who'd chosen to stay when leaving would have been safer. Thinking about every exile who trusted her to give them something worth more than survival. And understanding that the only way to honor that trust was to keep building, keep pushing, keep demonstrating that alternatives to empire structures weren't just possible but functional. That diversity didn't mean chaos. That power came in forms the empire had spent generations suppressing. That existence itself, maintained loudly and visibly despite everything designed to eliminate it, was the most dangerous weapon available to those the powerful had declared powerless. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The recognition agreement would face resistance. Some nobles would push back. Some exiles would question whether compromise with the empire betrayed everything they'd fought for. But tonight, in this moment, there was peace. The peace of knowing you'd survived the unsurvivable. The peace of understanding you'd become something your enemies couldn't categorize. The peace of existing on your own terms instead of the ones assigned to you. Leorine stood, her shoulder aching but functional, her body marked with scars that told the story of transformation through survival. She looked at the settlement one final time before heading to her own shelter. This was her legacy. Not an empire, not domination, not the throne she'd been promised and denied, just proof that when you strip away everything except the will to exist, Humans are capable of building impossible things in impossible places with impossible people. And sometimes that's enough. Sometimes survival evolves into something better. Sometimes the girl who is rejected becomes the woman who reshapes reality through sheer refusal to accept that reality is fixed. Sometimes being wolfless doesn't mean being powerless. It just means your power looks different than what the powerful recognize. And different given time and pressure and people willing to build instead of surrender can remake the world. Leering Viral walked into her shelter, lay down on a bed that smelled of wasteland dust and hard-won peace, and closed her eyes. Tomorrow, the building would continue. Tonight, rest was earned. And in the space between survival and whatever came next, she finally understood what Karth had meant when he'd called her the first. Not the first exile, not the first to fight back. The first to survive long enough to prove that surviving wasn't the point. Building was. And she'd built something that would outlast her, outgrow her, and eventually become bigger than the empire that had tried to erase it. That was enough. That was everything. That was the only victory that mattered.